Chair Randall, we are live to YouTube.
Well, good morning, everyone. How are you doing this morning? Welcome to the 7th Annual Northern Virginia Transportation Roundtable. Today, this roundtable is brought to you by the NVTA, the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and the Intelligent Transportation Society of Virginia. This year, we also have a new partner, Cambridge Systematics Incorporated, and they have graciously agreed to sponsor our event. And so we really do thank you, Cambridge, for being here today and for sponsoring us. I'm Phyllis Randall. I'm chair of the authority, but I'm also chair of Loudoun County, Virginia. And I really want to take the time for all of you joining us today. We probably could have convened in person by now, but by the time we knew that, it was a little too late, so we went on and did it virtually, but we're sure that next year we will be back in person again because it's, WebEx is nice and easy, but it's also much better to see one another's faces in person. But we did have to convene in person this year. So before we get into the roundtable, I do want to share a statement with you about conducting the meeting electronically. I should say that this meeting is conducted because Fairfax County, that's where NVT is located, declared the state of emergency in the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a statement on your screen right now. On March 17th, 2020, the Board of Supervisors in Fairfax County declared a local state of emergency, which remains in effect. In light of the continued state of emergency, we are conducting this roundtable in a remote setting, keeping safety top of mind and the impacts of COVID-19. Again, hopefully next year we will all be in person. But we thank you for being with us and for bearing with us today. Before we go any further, I do have some recognitions I'd like to make. And first, I want to say hello to my friend and State Senator Jennifer Boysko, who is a member of the Fairfax County, of the authority. Senator Boysko has been just such a great voice in Richmond, supporting transportation and supporting the authority. So welcome, Senator. We're glad you're here. Fairfax Supervisor Walter Alcorn, who is also a member of the MBTA Planning Coordination and Advisory Committee. He is here as well, and both of them are panelists today, so you're going to hear from them a little later on. And I also want to welcome many of our authority members. We have Mayor Jeanette Briscoe of Manassas Park, Mrs. Mary Hines, Mayor David Meyer of the City of Fairfax. As I said, Senator Boysko is going to be a panelist. Mr. John Lynch has joined us. Representative to Chairman McKay's office, Mr. Marcus Wadsworth is here. And a representative from Delegate Dave LaRock's office, Daniel Davis, is here as well. We have our Finance Committee Mayor, Jeanette Briscoe of Manassas Park has joined us. From the Planning and Program Committee of the MBTA, Mayor Briscoe is with us. Mayor Briscoe lifts very heavy in MBTA and always have, so we appreciate you. Mr. David Meyer of the City of Fairfax is here. Planning and Coordinating Advisory Committee, also called the PCAC Committee. We have board members, Takeas Coronas from Arlington County. Karen Tonis from Arlington County. I'm sorry about that. Walter Alcorn from Fairfax County. Supervisor Sylvia Glass, my colleague in Loudoun County. Councilmember Sarah Bagby from the City of Alexandria. Councilmember John Steele from the City of Fairfax. Vice Mayor Pamela Saboski from the City of Manassas, Councilmember Signe Friedrichs from the town of Herndon, Councilmember Stanley Milan from the town of Percival, which is just up the street in Loudoun County, and from our TAC committee, the Technical Advisory Committee, we have Chairman Randy Boyce, Andy Morris, and Karen Kaplan. From our Transportation and Technology Committee, the TTC Committee, we have a lot of committees. We again have Mayor Jeanette Briscoe of Manassas Park. That's the third time I've said her name, which tells you how busy she is in the authority and how much we appreciate her. Dr. Richard Mudge, Reg Foray, Hari Siripathy, Andre Messi, Dr. Bob Schreitner, who's a panelist, Greg Rogers, who's a panelist, Kathy McGee, who is a panelist, and also joining us today, we have one other elected officials, Vice Mayor Marty Martinez has graciously said he would join us. He is from the town of Leedsburg. Leedsburg is, of course, one of the towns in MBTA. And Senator Warner, who will be giving us some words in just a second, has also asked his representative, Joe Machayo, to join us on the line. So Joe is on the line with us today. So all of you, we appreciate the time, you all taking the time to join us. Our panelists, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak and share some of the things we talk about in the authority, both the local level and towns and the state level as well. I want to welcome you all, whether you're watching on WebEx, whether you're live streaming on the MBTA YouTube channel. MBTA happens to be the coolest body in Virginia because we have our own YouTube channel. I love that. We're glad you're here. It's really great to see you. And as I said, Senator Warner wants to bring us just a brief video. And so we're going to share a few words from Senator Warner, and I will be back on the other side.
Hi, Virginia Senator Mark Warner here, and I want to welcome you to the 7th Annual Northern Virginia Transportation Roundtable. I want to thank the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and the Intelligence Transportation Virginia Society for putting this roundtable together. I have a particular affection for the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority because literally 20 years ago, I, as governor, signed the legislation that created the authority. And I've been very proud of the great work that you've done over the years, working across a number of jurisdictions to make sure that Northern Virginia has the kind of 21st century transportation system that we need. Now, federal help is finally on the way. As most of you know, I was one of the original negotiators of the Infrastructure Act that President Biden has signed. That will put enormous amounts of additional money into roads, bridges, into our airports, into resilience, into metro, and long-term rail. This is terribly important as we think in a multimodal way for Northern Virginia. Also, from earlier legislation, I've worked with Senator Tim Kaine to make sure that electric vehicles have a critical role going forward. In the American Rescue Plan, we had $7.5 billion for electric charging stations and another $7.5 billion for electric buses. We all know that in America, we're going to buy 25,000 new school buses over the next 5 years. I'd like them to be electric. I'd like them to be made in Virginia. And as we think about expanding our electric vehicle network, we've got to do more to create charging stations. The $7.5 billion that came in the American Rescue Plan will be that critical seed capital to make sure that there are charging stations that are easily accessible all across the region. We all know the transportation challenges in Northern Virginia, particularly post-COVID, as people get back on the road, remain daunting. But I think this roundtable and thinking in a forward-leaning 21st century way, multimodal, that there's still much to be accomplished. And hopefully with this enormous once-in-a-generation federal resources, you'll have the tools to get the job done. Again, congratulations.
Well, thank you, Senator Warner. You know, you don't often hear United States senators say the words multimodal more than once in a speech, which makes you really understand that he really understands how important the MBTA is and the fact that we don't just do roads, we do transit, we do metro, we do bike paths and walking trails. We do it all in MBTA, and we really appreciate Senator Warner appreciating the hard work we're doing, and even more signing that House Bill 2313 that started MBTA off on its way. So thank you, Senator Warner. This is an excellent event, and I promise you're going to stay informed for everyone. It's going to be informative. It's going to be interactive. You're going to have fun. It will include live polling, so your participation and your opportunity to ask questions will also be there. regardless of what platform you're using as you join us today. MBTA staff is going to fill you in on the details a little bit later of how to be interactive during this meeting, but just get ready for that because it's going to be fun. We do have a full house for this event. We have professionals from both the public and the private sector. And MBTA is really, really proud that we are continuing to have our partnership with the Intelligent Transportation Society of Virginia. And we also have support, as I said earlier, this year we have support from Cambridge Systematics Incorporated. That's who is helping to bring us this roundtable today. And all of those forces continue to stay abreast of transportation and technologies in the region and the Commonwealth, and really even across the country, because we know that what's happening in other parts of the country impacts what's happening in Northern Virginia. During the roundtable, we share with you the NVTA is developing its inaugural Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, or TTSP. We have a lot of acronyms in the authority, and we sought your input through we will seek your input through live polling. It's my pleasure to inform you that the authority has also adopted the TTSB, and staff has begun that implementation. I really want to take a moment and say thank you to Monica Backman and the NVTA staff, because I cannot tell you how hard they work. And they are a small but mighty staff that gets it done. And the TTSB has been something that they have really brought to us and have been working on and have felt passionately about. So Monica and to all the staff at NVTA, thank you so much. We also informed that you will have upgoing updates of the long-range transportation plan for Northern Virginia. It's called Transaction, and you're going to hear more about Transaction later this morning. So thanks again for the time that you're taking to join us for this interactive virtual event. We look forward to the live discussion. Please have a good time. And again, we'll see you next year in person. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to David Ludwig, who's president of the Intelligent Transportation Society of Virginia and vice president of Eastern Operations Lumini 8. David, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Randall, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you all just very briefly on behalf of ITS Virginia. We really appreciate the partnership with Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and this annual roundtable event is always a highlight for me. There are so many innovative projects and initiatives going on here in Nova involving various modes of transportation, as Chair Randall just pointed out, and so did Senator Mark Warner allude to, and the new technologies. It's always a great set of panels that we have in this event. Speaking as an audience member for most of the prior 6 roundtables, I know that we all enjoy and learn a lot from the perspectives that we get participating here. It's unfortunate in some respects that we cannot meet in person this morning, but I believe there was at least one year where I tried to register for the roundtable the very next day after the registration portal went live, and it was already too late. So this has always been a bit of a hot ticket, and I guess the one silver lining to meeting virtually like this is that at least everyone can get a seat, which is great. I'll just put in a quick plug for ITS Virginia. We certainly have a lot of common stakeholders with NVTA, but just in case anyone participating here this morning is not as familiar with ITSVA, we are the state chapter of ITS America, supporting the use of intelligent transportation systems and technology-based solutions to save lives, improve mobility and efficiency, and increase accessibility and equity in our transportation systems right here in the Commonwealth. I know that many of you joined us for our legislative reception in February, which is one of our other 2 major annual events. And we hope to see all of you back in person at the ITS Virginia annual meeting and conference on May 26th and 27th in Richmond. So please mark your calendars for that as well. That's ITSVA's first in-person annual conference since May of 2019. So it'll be 3 years. We are really looking forward to that and to seeing all of you there. And with that, I will pass it to Mackenzie with my thanks to the entire NVTA team for organizing these fantastic panels this morning. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dave. As Dave mentioned, my name is Mackenzie Love, and I'm a regional transportation planner with the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, and I'm also a member of the board of directors for ITSVA. I would like to welcome everyone as well, regardless of whether you're joining us on WebEx or YouTube. And we look forward to making this an interactive event for everyone. I will be one of your MCs for this event, along with Keith Jasper, the Principal of Transportation Planning and Programming for NVTA, and I'll be walking you through the interactive live polls today. which we will begin with our first live poll now. If you have not registered to participate in the live polls, I'd encourage you to go ahead and do so at this time. The way to do that is open a new text message on your cell phone and send a message to the number 22333. And in the body of that message, put the phrase the NVTA 068. All of that information is also showing on your screen currently, and it will be on the top of every polling slide for your reference. If you experience any technical difficulties in signing up, please let us know via the chat features on either WebEx or YouTube, and our staff will attempt to help you sort that out. We will do one introductory poll to kind of get everyone used to how this works, and I'll put that up on your screen now. So the first question is, over the past calendar year, how often have deliveries been made to your home? Please consider deliveries of packages, prepared food, and groceries. I will let you know that we have asked this question in the last 2 roundtables, so we're looking forward to being able to compare those results for you here and now. And I see a few of you are starting to respond, which is wonderful. Thank you for participating. Just to let you know, you can select your answer choice by typing just the letter that is beside the answer choice you wish to select. If at any point you would like to change your answer on this or any subsequent poll, simply type the word undo into your text message and it will clear your last answer and allow you to participate again. With that, I'd like to give you a bit of a review of the responses we received to this question in the past. In 2020, we asked this question about a week before lockdowns went into place for the pandemic. And we saw that the response once per week and multiple times per week tied for the top answer with 33% of responses each. In 2021, when we hosted this event virtually for the first time, we saw that the response multiple times per week had surged to 62%. So quite the growth there. And now I'm seeing that once a week and multiple times per week are both coming in around around 42%. So that's showing a continued reliance on these deliveries, which surely impact the way not only we get our goods, but also the way we travel throughout the region. So that is why we're interested in that here and why NVTA has been watching this over the last few years. I think that we're getting stabilized answers here. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll. I will take us through one more that is going to be a little bit more relevant to our first panel today that will focus on electrification. Great. The question here is, thinking about the next time you purchase or lease a vehicle, how likely are you to consider an electric vehicle, excluding hybrids? I'll give you all a few minutes to respond to that one. I see your answers are coming in, so thank you all again. This makes this a really dynamic event and hopefully engaging and worthwhile for you as well. I'd like to inform you that we have asked this question before also, but in NVTA's perception survey, and you can find the full results of that survey on NVTA's websites and as it was presented to the authority as well. When we asked the question in our survey, we saw that 36% of respondents said that they would consider purchasing or leasing an electric vehicle. And I'm giving it a few minutes to even out here. I'm seeing some movement across the numbers. But it's looking like we are seeing, wow, the plurality of folks are saying they're somewhat likely to consider an electric vehicle. And we're also seeing other folks say they are very likely with 24% of respondents, or even a few of you are extremely likely. But there are some groups here, about 30% of respondents, that say they're not too likely to consider that. So this will be an interesting thing to consider as you hear our next group of panelists speak about electrification. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for participating. We'll have a few more of these polling points throughout the event, and we really appreciate you taking the opportunity to join us in them. like to hand it over to Keith Jasper to introduce our moderator and panelists for the first panel.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounding good.
Good, thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. And we're going to get into business now with the first panel. Just before we do that, I'd like to introduce this morning's moderator, Robert and Bob McCartney, who is host of COG's Think Regionally podcast, and a former editor, columnist, and correspondent for the Washington Post. It's been one of the features of this roundtable that not only do we have great panels and panelists and live polling now, which people actually ask us if we're going to do that again because they enjoy it so much. But the other kind of real pillar of the roundtable is the moderator, and Bob's the latest in a long line of esteemed moderators that we've had, including Martin DeCaro, Robert Thompson, otherwise known as Dr. Gridlock from Washington Post, Max Smith, and Jordan Pascal. So I know Bob is going to do a fantastic job. He's been working really diligently over the last couple of weeks on this with us. So looking forward to hearing more from Bob shortly. Let me move to the power panel, our first panel, comprising a great blend of policymakers and decision makers. We put this panel together because now seems like the perfect point in time when the entire transportation industry and beyond are embracing the need for more sustainable approaches to our use of the planet's natural resources, and electrification of the transportation system is right up there at the top of the list. So I know this panel is going to provide some great ideas about not just the vision and the opportunities, but also the challenges that go with electrification. I'm not going to read the bios of any of our panelists, but I do encourage you to take a look at them on the website. You'll be, like me, probably very floored by how smart and accomplished these panelists are. I will just note, though, that perhaps to tease you over there, one of these four panelists in their bio states that they are still wondering when personal jetpacks are going to start showing up. And another of these four panelists is a nationally recognized expert on electronics recycling systems. So take a look and see if you can figure out who they are. But let me begin in the reverse order that we're going to hear from the panelists, with Bob Schneider, the Executive Director for OmniRide. OmniRide is the operating name for the mobility services offered by the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission, otherwise known as PRTC. And OmniRide operates express and local bus services, particularly along the 66 and 95 corridors. But it also operates other things as well, including carpools and vanpools. And I would kind of mention that in my personal opinion, one of the transportation jewels of the Northern Virginia transportation system is the Vanpool Alliance. So check out what the Vanpool Alliance does when you get a chance. As if buses were not enough, and carpooling and vanpooling, OmniRide also co-sponsors VRE, commuter rail services, in partnership with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. And OmniRide's operating area includes Prince William County, Manassas, Manassas Park, Stafford, Spotsylvania, and the city of Fredericksburg. The next speaker I want to introduce is Jeff King, Director of Climate, Energy, and Air Programs for COG. And I'm just going to summarize Jeff by saying that in the words of his boss, he is the most knowledgeable person within COG the various activities that we're talking about here, but not just in COG, in the region, and for that matter, in the nation when it comes to matters related to electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. Supervisor Alcorn represents the Hunter Mill district of Fairfax County, which, if you're not familiar, his district covers Reston and Vienna. As mentioned on the screen, he is a member of our Planning Coordination Advisory Committee, where he has been a fantastic representative for the county and a great contributor to MBTA. And finally, our initial speaker here this morning is Senator Jennifer Boysko. She represents the 33rd district, which includes parts of Loudoun and Fairfax County. And I would just say from my personal experience and observation, Senator Boysko is both passionate and knowledgeable on the subject of electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. And indeed, she's also, she doesn't just talk the talk, she walks the walk as well. She's introduced legislation at the General Assembly on this very topic. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Senator Jennifer Boysko. Thank you.
Keith, thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here with you all. I'm Jennifer Boysko. I represent the 33rd Senate District. It includes parts of Fairfax and Loudoun counties, including Dulles Airport. I'm a member of the Senate Transportation Committee, and I am the Senate's representative on NVTA. It's a real honor to be with you all today and with this esteemed panel. I would like to point out that I'm not the person who was wondering about the jetpacks, but I do think that's an excellent question to ask. But seriously, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all about the transition to electric vehicles in Virginia and in our nation. Here in Virginia, over the past several years, we've really taken hold of the need to move from gas-powered cars and trucks to vehicles that are powered by electricity generated from clean fuels, because we need to have energy independence in today's political climate. And speaking of climate, we also acknowledge that climate change is here and it's affecting us all. Today, we all know too well that the gas prices are at a record high with the unstable situation in Ukraine and Russia, and that's facing us front and center. Meanwhile, during the summer, while it might have been sleeting this morning in some parts of Virginia, the heat index it's not unusual for the heat index to be 110 degrees in Northern Virginia. And the air pollution that is linked with high rates of lung disease like asthma and COPD, especially on disparate communities of low-income communities and communities of color. By 2050, there are some experts who have actually projected that the typical number of heat wave days in Virginia will increase from about 10 days a year to nearly 60 days a year. So, that's 2 months a year where people can't work or exercise or live safely outside without air conditioning. And not only is that a threat to our health, but also to our economy. So switching to electric vehicles is one of the best tools that we have to fight climate change. And the transportation sector is the largest source of carbon pollution in Virginia. It produces almost half of our CO2 emissions, and 70% of that comes from our personal vehicles. Electricity to power an EV in Virginia emits less than 30% of those CO2s emitted by an equivalent gas car. And the clean car standards that we passed have been projected to reduce the Virginia CO2 emissions pretty significantly. So my colleagues and I, over the past several years, have taken some decisive action to encourage investments in EVs and in the infrastructure that's needed to support them. We took those steps because we recognize the moral imperative of fighting climate change, but also the enormous economic benefits that will be created by high-quality technology jobs here in Virginia. Nationally and internationally, the future of transportation is in electric vehicles. This past December, I attended a national conference where Andy Klobens, who is with the National Automobile Dealers Association, spoke as one of the keynote speakers. He made it clear that from the business perspective, EVs are the future. And this is a rare space where automobile manufacturers, environmental community, the business community, dealers, all stand together with one voice, compelling us to move forward with policies and programs that include increased deployment of infrastructure and incentives for EVs. The coalition working most closely in Virginia has been the Advanced Energy Economy Consortium. And, it's been a real pleasure to work with them. EVs have spurred innovation and investment in the United States automotive industry, creating new manufacturing and engineering jobs across the country. And we just heard from Senator Warner about the infrastructure bill. Will build a network of EV chargers to facilitate long-distance travel and provide convenient charging options. The U.S. market share of plug-in EVs is about a third of the Chinese EV market. In 2020, plug-ins at EVs here in the United States were about 2.3% of new car sales compared to 6.2% in China. So our business, again, I'll say it again, the business, the environmental community, the dealers, the auto manufacturers, and you may know that Volkswagen is headquartered right here in my district. Everybody is together believing that we must have change, and we should be the world leaders, and Virginia is primed to be at the forefront of this technological opportunity. The federal law, you heard from Senator Warner, would invest about $7.5 billion to build out the first ever national network of EV chargers. It's a critical part of the Biden-Harris administration's plan. And Virginia would expect to receive about $106 million over the next 5 years to support the expansion of the EV chargers here in the state. Virginia also would have the opportunity to apply for grants out of the $2.5 billion available for that EV charging. And as we've already begun to invest in EVs, we have an opportunity to lead in clean technology. Nationwide, there are about 273,000 jobs associated with clean vehicle technologies. These technologies include everything from more efficient transmissions and turbocharged engines to lightweight steel and aluminum to electric power steering and regenerative braking. So let me just go over a little bit of what we've done in Virginia over the past several years to increase job opportunities created by the clean fuel vehicle industry and explain how those advances are going to be at risk if we neglect to move forward. So let's just look at it. In 2020, Virginia employed about 5,000 workers in the clean vehicle industry. By incentivizing the adoption, we could create nearly 30,000 jobs here in Virginia. As of August 2021, there were about 24,000 EVs on Virginia roads. You just saw in the poll that there's a significant interest in purchasing an EV. There's a concern about making sure that there are charging stations. So we're trying to work on both of those. And there have also been efforts to exploring electrified transport with our Department of Environmental Quality for our utilities and private investors. So in 2020, I asked the Secretary of Transportation to conduct a study on the electrification of the transportation system here in Virginia. And the report, as you can imagine, identified transportation infrastructure issues as the top barrier to EV adoption. So in 2021, I carried a bill that added electrification of the transportation planning to the Virginia Energy Plan. And by incorporating the planning for EV infrastructure, we are making sure that Virginia is going to be ready and has thoughtfully prepared to support a clean energy transportation system. And as residents are thinking about this, they're going to be confident that there will be charging stations available throughout the Commonwealth, no matter where you live. That's not all we've done, though. In 2021, we also passed a clean car standard bill directing the State Air Pollution Control Board to implement a low emissions and zero emissions vehicle program, beginning with the model year 2025, which is just around the corner. The initial target is 8% of new vehicles sold in Virginia as electric or plug-in hybrids. We also passed an electric vehicle rebate bill, creating a fund in theory, to provide buyers who purchase EVs with a cash rebate. Unfortunately, that has not been funded yet, but I still remain hopeful that it will. This year in the 2022 session, the transportation electrification continued to make headways, and we built on some of the significant success from the Clean Car Initiative in 2021 with several bills. The best one that I can tell you about is Senator Monty Mason's bill, SB 575, which it was supported by a broad cross-section of industry leaders, environmental advocates, and conservative allies. It's a fleet optimization legislation bill that requires that before the purchase of a light or medium-duty vehicle operated in Virginia by the state fleet, they would conduct an analysis comparing EVs and internal combustion engine vehicles together. And if the cost is lower for the EV, the agency would be required to buy it. And it's our hope that with the smart procurement legislation, it'll help speed electrification of the state fleet and diffuse knowledge to the counties and the local fleet operators as well, that this is really the direction to go in. We also passed legislation, HB 450, sponsored by our new delegate, Bennett Parker, and SB 278, sponsored by Senator Eben, imposing penalties on non-EVs parked in spaces that are reserved for EV charging out in the public. So that's all sounding pretty good. But in the wake of, I have some downside here. In the wake of November's election, incoming Republican leadership in the House signaled that they were not as interested in energy and environmental policies that had been enacted during the prior 2 years. And true to their word, Senate and House Republicans filed over a dozen bills, not only to undo the Virginia Clean Economy Act and the Clean Car Standards. Some of the legislation, such as HB 118 from Delegate Freitas, SB 695 from Senator Stewart, sought to wholesale repeal the VCEA and the Clean Cars. Other legislation, such as HB 74 from Delegate Ware and HB 1267 from Delegate Wilt, took a more strategic and surgical approach. Ware's bill attempted to exempt heavy industrial consumers from the VCEA's non-bypassable costs, while Wilt's would have delayed implementation in clean cars by another 5 years, pushing it off to 2030. One of the pro-EV policy initiatives that I was a part of, led by Senator Dave Marsden, SB 708, would have set up a structure to harness these federal funds that we talked about earlier becoming available. Unfortunately, the bill itself died in House appropriations this year. It would have established a driving decarbonization program and fund to assist developers with non-utility costs associated with the installation of the EV charging stations. This seems to be a very common sense and thoughtful and pragmatic way of setting this up. It was federal funds coming in, capped at about $20 million, with $5 million in federally grants reserved for charging stations that would be located in historically, economically distressed areas. We continue to have budget negotiations, as you're probably aware. We are not done with our work this year. I have hopes that the policy will be incorporated into the final budget, and we will be able to harness those federal dollars. I mean, it's important that you all share your concerns and interest in that with other policymakers in Virginia. This isn't the time to put the brakes on or change course on EVs, and I'm excited about the progress we've made in Virginia, and I'm optimistic that we are all collaboratively going to continue to work together to understand that EVs are our future and such an important part of our economy. They're better for the environment, better for our national security, and it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us because businesses are ready to invest in the new jobs in all parts of Virginia. So just in final, let's just go over a couple of data points. The Clean Car Standards could produce almost 30,000 new jobs in Virginia, resulting in $21 million in net total benefits. The Build on Virginia's Commitment to EV Infrastructure, DEQ, has already allocated funding through the recent Volkswagen settlement to expand charging infrastructure that would put 95% of Virginians within 30 miles of a charger once completed. And about $106 million from the recently passed federal infrastructure bill will help Virginia with federal funds to continue to build our charging infrastructure. We can't afford to go backwards on our commitment in advancing EV technology, and I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to go over this with you today, and I look forward to the rest of the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator Boysko. I believe we are moving to Supervisor Alcorn.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to go after Senator Boysko, and she really did lay out a lot of the issues, why we're talking about electrification, what our environmental challenges are, and also really provided a great framework for here in Virginia, the opportunities and some of the challenges we're facing in terms of getting getting electrification to become a reality. I wanted to bring it down just another level or two. And just as a little bit more background, I do serve on the Board of Supervisors representing the Hunter Mill District. I also chair the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors Transportation Committee. And we have been having active discussions and decisions relating to the electrification of vehicles in Fairfax County, both public sector and private sector. And I'll be touching on that over the next few minutes. So also I want to thank Senator Warner. His comments were very helpful, laying out at the federal level the support that it's now coming down to those of us on the local level that will help make electrification a reality. It is a game changer, no doubt, to have those resources in the pipeline, and it's something I'm very excited about and looking forward to showing up on in our jurisdictions during the coming years. So, and let me just start by saying I am happy that we're talking about electrification. It is the most accessible. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Chair Randall. And Chair Randall, thank you for your leadership as well on this. This is NVTA's really stepped up and is helping and put all this transformation that we're talking about and combining improvements to our transportation system with electrification. It's so important that we think of things holistically and systematically. And I know under your leadership, we are doing that regionally. So thank you. So, and I am glad we're talking about electrification. This is, at least at this point, it is our best opportunity for moving to zero emission transportation system. And as Senator Boysko mentioned, in our area, this is the #1 climate challenge. This is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in our area is our transportation system. So it's very appropriate that we spend a lot of time focusing on and attention and resources on changing that fact. So I want to talk about two different challenges. They're really quite distinct. One is electrification in transit, and the other is electrification in personally owned vehicles. So first of all, in transit, there is some good news on the transit side. We should remind ourselves that our rail system is already electric in our region. So with Metro Rail, so that is not a big chunk of infrastructure we have to worry about going electric because it's already electric. The other part of the WMATA program, and as well as many of us jurisdictions, operate a different transit system that is fossil fuel based primarily, and that of course is our bus system. So the bus system is something that's developed and it continues to grow and provide essential services. You know, during the pandemic, I think we learned a lot about how important our bus systems are to our essential workers. We've had return to transit happen much faster with our bus riders than we have with Metro Rail. And in large part, that's because a lot of our bus riders don't have viable alternatives to get to work, to get to shop, to get to essential trips, basically, to make that happen. So, but the bus system does need to change and evolve. As Senator Warner mentioned, it's not only the electric buses that have to be purchased and acquired, but it's also, of course, the charging infrastructure and the other infrastructure that does that. I want to give a shout out to a leader in our region who's kind of jumped in and taken the plunge, which is Alexandria. The city of Alexandria last fall went to a all out, we're going to go all electric on our bus fleet. They did that, and they are right in the throes of that transition. And, you know, I don't want to throw any cold water on anybody doing this, but it is true. We heard at the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission last December a very interesting report from Alexandria on some of the challenges they're facing. For example, with battery technology the way it is, cold weather can still be a challenge for electric buses. Hills can be a challenge as well. Also, they noted that Alexandria had purchased buses, electric buses, from 2 different vendors, and they were told that there was interoperability across the 2 vendor systems. They were discovering that that wasn't necessarily the case in all situations. So bless you, Alexandria, for taking the dive and figuring out some of these really important pieces and how our transit fleets can go electric and what some of the challenges are in helping figure this out. And I think it's important not to minimize some of those challenges. They are completely overcomable, and we are, as public officials, but also our transit operators, are figuring this out, and we are pushing them very strongly to figure it out as quickly as possible. But we do need to keep in mind, remember, who is riding our buses? These are folks, by and large, if the bus doesn't run, they may not get to work. So let's make sure we keep that in mind. This is not just a luxury for many of our bus riders, but as we make this transition, let's make sure that we are doing so in a way that we continue to provide those essential transit services to our community. So one other thing I want to, again, thank Senator Warner, and there are federal grants coming soon that many of our local governments will be taking advantage of to change and move the infrastructure and pay for that, as well as purchasing electric vehicles. One final thing I want to say before I turn it back over to the moderator. There's another issue with privately owned vehicles that I need to flag. And thank you, Senator Boysko and others, for getting the charging infrastructure in place. A lot of excellent movement on public charging stations, both in our public spaces, but also in our retail spaces, our work spaces. But I did want to point out the Department of Energy notes that most electric vehicle owners charge at home, and they do charge, if not all overnight, at least in the evening and sometimes overnight. I wanted to point out in our region, and I'm one of these people, many of us do not have private garages that this is possible. Those of us who live in townhouse communities that have a sidewalk that runs in between the closest electrical outlet and our vehicle and where we park it, that overnight charging is not nearly as simple. There are a lot of other legal issues. We basically, in Fairfax County and across the region, we have these things called homeowners associations who actually own the property that our cars are parked on overnight. Many of us that live in townhouse communities, other multifamily communities, sometimes it's apartment owners that own the infrastructure, own the garages, own the parking lots where overnight charging or evening charging would need to happen. That's a huge challenge that is something that we're going to be working through in Fairfax County, and I would encourage those others in the region and elsewhere who are working on that challenge. Let's share the information, let's share best practices, and at some point, Senator Boysko, we might have to be coming back to you for some tweaks in the law to really make sure that can happen. So again, I'll be quiet. I look forward to the Q&A portion, but thank you for the opportunity to present a local perspective on this.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Alcorn. And he did mention there the initiative taken by Alexandria with the Dash bus system. Just a little self-serving comment here from me. MBTA has $12 million on that acquisition of electric buses. So I think, yeah, there's no doubt MBTA has got not just a desire on this, but also a demonstrated track record. But yeah, thank you for your remarks, Supervisor, and stand by for the Q&A coming up shortly. Just before we transition to Jeff King, just would like to remind everyone on WebEx and on YouTube, if you have any questions, feel free to type those into the chat box, and we will try and get as many of those covered if there's time later on. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Jeff King.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff King. I'm the Director of Climate, Energy, and Air Programs at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. For those of you who may not know about our organization, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, otherwise known as COG, is an association of 24 of our local government members across the Maryland, DC, Virginia region. We were founded a bit more than 50 years ago, and we have a wide range of interest across the region. We have a number of technical and policy committees that are particularly interested in the topic of climate change, air quality, and transportation, including electric vehicles. The COG Board of Directors is really the main body that forms the regional policy, and in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, identified electric vehicles one of its top priorities for action on climate. About a little over 10 years ago, COG formed the Climate, Energy, Environment Policy Committee, otherwise known as CEPC, that's been leading the effort on climate change in the region for the last 10 years, and me and my team have been supporting that work. We have the Transportation Planning Board, which some of the folks here on this call are members of, and do great work on transportation planning in the region. We have the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee that's been charged for the last couple decades on finding ways to reduce emissions and clean the air, and been a remarkable success story, and the amount of achievement we've made. These policy boards are supported by a number of technical committees, including our Built Environment Energy Advisory Committee, Electric Vehicle Work Group. We have a Regional Public Transportation Subcommittee, a Freight Subcommittee, commuter connections programs, transportation land use connection programs. So a number of really exciting and interesting areas to help with solutions in this area. For our work on electric vehicles, not only in terms of setting the policy, we also track a number of indicators, including the total number of electric and hybrid vehicles in the region, as well as the number of electric vehicle charging stations. We've been working with the regional public transportation agencies and local governments on tracking and sharing information on both transit bus and school bus electrification projects, and it's been really exciting to see some of the developments in that area. And as I mentioned, climate change is really in part driving our heightened interest in electric vehicles in the region and across the globe. Here in our region in 2020, the COG board adopted a new climate goal of a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. The long-term emission reduction goal that was adopted back in 2008 calls for an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. And both of these goals are going to be quite challenging to meet. COG members, and it's interesting to know, some of our COG members are even now striving for goals that go even farther, including striving for net zero emissions in the 2035 to 2050 timeframe. So real challenging set of goals. For this new 2030 climate goal of a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, COG's Climate, Energy, Environment Policy Committee has developed and adopted a 2030 Climate Energy Action Plan that was adopted in late 2020. And it includes a number of strategies, more than 30, but some of these strategies focus explicitly on net zero transportation, including through electric vehicles. So now that these aggressive goals have been set in the last year or so, COG has really been pivoting to support and enhance implementation of these and other strategies and actions to help the region meet these new climate goals. One of the things we've done, we've established a consulting team to support our local government members, and we've been actively supporting a number of local climate, energy, electric vehicle planning processes across the region. in the last 2 or 3 years, and we're currently expanding the number of projects that are being supported across the region. One of our newest initiatives, I mentioned the COG board. The main focus at the March meeting of the COG Board of Directors was on climate change as one of the 4 pillars of its unified planning framework for the region, including focused on high capacity transit and equity emphasis areas and housing affordability. One of the main areas is interest in addressing climate change as part of that. One of the initiatives we're fostering is a focus on developing a regional electric vehicle deployment plan. I think some of the thinking is that as a region, if we can coordinate and collaborate together and demonstrate that we have a plan, that it will help us be a little bit more competitive in some of the future funding opportunities that we see before us. And as part of that deployment plan, one of our main focus is to develop projections of future electric vehicle ownership in the region, and to try to assess the need for, what would be required in terms of the supporting infrastructure, in terms of EV charging stations or other utility investments that we'll need to support that power need. We've also, in addition to the community aspect of electric vehicle deployment, we've also been supporting our local governments on these sorts of electric vehicle or energy plans for government operations. So the concept of government by example and leading by example, we think is very important. Local governments in the region currently working on electric vehicle plans in Virginia include Arlington County and the city of Alexandria. In Maryland, we've been actively working with Prince George's County, Frederick County, and the city of Rockville. And we're really looking forward to other local governments in our membership to coordinate and work with us to further develop these EV deployment plans. We've also been looking for leadership from organizations such as NVRC, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, Dominion, the main power provider in Northern Virginia, Metro, the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, which recently had some really good news related to solar and electric vehicle deployment at Dulles Airport, which we're really pleased to see, as well as Alan Harnett and Matt Wade from the Virginia Clean Cities Coalition to help us do some of the heavy lifting on this effort. There are a number of other things we're interested in and working on, including efforts to identify the best practices on zoning, permitting, and utility regulations, trying to identify and find ways to remove barriers to some of the deployment challenges we may face, and to better facilitate deployment of the charging infrastructure that we'll need to support the transition to electric vehicles. We've also been interested in supporting cooperative purchasing of vehicles. In the last few months, in fact, we've been supporting a pilot program in the region to see if we can support consumer interest in purchasing electric vehicles. As of yesterday on our team call, we heard that we have around 800 residents and businesses in one of our localities already pledging to purchase electric vehicles. And as part of that initiative, we are working closely with the Washington Area New Automobile Dealers Association. It's been really uplifting to have the support of the dealer community in our region and the OEMs looking to expand the market for electric vehicles in the region. One other key area of interest is to support the cleaning of the electric grid. As we move from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, I think we know it's going to be increasingly important to ensure that the electric power that we rely on is sourced from renewable or zero emission sources such as solar and wind. We are also closely tracking and supporting efforts in the region to look at the possibility of using hydrogen as a fuel source for both power generation as well as for fuel cells to generate power for electric transportation. And I think many believe that solution may be very important for enabling the further electrification, particularly of transit buses, which have longer duty cycles, as it were, per day than, let's say, a school bus application. I'll close by saying that in addition to focusing on on-road electrification opportunities, the Council of Governments has also been doing a lot of work over the years on repowering off-road vehicles with cleaner engines, including heavy construction equipment, as well as locomotives and marine passenger vessels. We are really interested in developments related to electric solutions in these applications as well. I should say that we have an RFP out on the street right now to repower diesel locomotives at Union Station in Washington, and we're pretty sure that the electric solution vendors are going to be coming out and really pushing us on the notion that in addition to diesel, there are electric solutions in these sorts of applications, and we need to start looking at that a little bit more closely. And so I in particular am interested a bit in the opportunities to electrify passenger rail south of the Potomac River, both with Amtrak as well as commuter rail such as VRE. And I think as it relates to both our air quality challenges in the region as well as our climate initiatives, I think addressing this need to transition away from fossil fuel powered heavy vehicles could really help with our transportation, air quality, and climate challenges. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And next up, we have Bob Schneider. Oh, over to you.
Yes, good morning, and thank you so much. Bob Schneider, I am the jetpack person. I grew up, of course, in the G.I. Joe era or watching the $6 Million Man, and I was absolutely convinced that by 2020, we'd have something like the hover skateboard or something, yet here we are, just still trying to figure out what's coming. So jumping into this, a few interesting things. Why is transit lagging behind in the marketplace? In reality, the concept of electric vehicles actually hasn't caught up to us from a transit perspective. If you think about it, the very first motorized transit vehicles were called trolleys, and they ran on electric grids and catenary systems across the country 100 years ago. If you've ever been to San Francisco or you've been to Seattle, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those systems are alive and well, and they are electric buses attached to those catenary wires. This goes back literally 100 years. And those who know their transit history know that we were almost all founded by utility companies who had the monopoly on electricity. Dig around your city and you'll often find that utilities and transit were one and the same. So by our very nature, we've been involved in electric vehicles almost our entire history. Meanwhile, to this day, we are a traffic and pollution reducing service. It's what we do, it's baked into the cake. So if you take a look back at the last 20, 30 years, in the mid-1990s, compressed natural gas became the focus. It's a cleaner propulsion system than diesel fuel, and it was a domestic fuel. So it really came onto the scene and got a lot of excitement. By the early 2000s, we were already replacing 20% of diesel fuel with biofuels. So you probably remember B20. You saw the rise of ethanol and the use of those kinds of products to help offset the use of the fossil fuel. By the mid-2000s, we had the diesel hybrid promise. We had the buses coming in to help give us improved fuel economy, lower emissions, and I've personally worked with propane fleet since 2004. So with a career spanning 22, 23 years, we've been working with some form of low-no technology in order to reduce pollution. It's very, very much part of what transit does, and it's one of our core elements and philosophies that doesn't get the attention in Northern Virginia that it does in other places, because in Northern Virginia, it's about the congestion and the commute. But if you go to a lot of other communities, it's about the pollution. So it's a very different perspective, and we tend to forget that transit is a solution to both. So it's now 2022. EVs are back in the discussion, but the big question again is, why aren't they more prevalent in the transit industry? And it's not just us. If you take a look around, it's not prevalent in the construction industry. It's not prevalent in freight. It's not prevalent at factories. Well, why? And the answer is very simply power. So to help frame the challenge, I'm going to go back to the future. I hope you get the energy joke mixed in there. But zooming out, we've been using really two primary types of liquid fuel for about 100 years, gasoline and diesel. And understanding them helps us understand the conundrum. So we're going to get a little bit technical for a minute, but I promise just a minute. Gasoline is less dense, it's a lighter fuel, it burns quickly, allows lightweight vehicles to accelerate quickly. The challenge is for every gallon of fuel we burn, we release about 19.5 pounds of CO2 into the air, or cubic feet into the air. We can't avoid it. It's the chemistry. We're taking toxins from the oil in the ground, converting it to energy, and then turning that into toxins in the air. That's just the chemical process. It's what it does. It's made for high horsepower engines and makes up about 75% of the fuel consumed in the United States. Diesel, however, is only about 10% of miles traveled, but consumes 25% of total fuel. So we have a mismatch, and it produces about 23% of pollution because it is more toxic per gallon of fuel due to its chemical properties. It's a more dense fuel, it's heavier because it's a refinement process from the creation of gasoline. So it's more dense, it has a lower flash point, and it's super efficient in heavy duty engines, and it's unparalleled because it allows for increased torque. And again, I told you we'd get technical. To explain horsepower versus torque, the old saying is horsepower is how fast you hit the wall, torque is how far you travel through the wall. So if you think about it, big vehicles are moving freight, they're moving construction materials, and in our case, people. So now let's zoom back in and understanding that example. If we pull the concept into the marketplace, electric vehicles are ready to go for light and medium duty fleets where you frequently see unleaded fuel. The manufacturers have completely embraced this for personal vehicle use. As you've heard from the prior conversation, we're funding the infrastructure. Your homes already have the infrastructure, save for the townhouse communities. But as anyone who's driven an EV knows, not all charging systems are easy to find. They're not always prevalent. Your city and your county and your business can easily add these vehicles or charging station infrastructure. And as a matter of fact, OmniRide will be taking advantage of the new infrastructure bill to apply for grants to migrate our mid and light duty fleet to EV systems, even adding charging stations at our facilities. And we've already started the initial discussions with VDOT to see if we can take advantage of maybe park and ride lots and offer charging options to attract EV owners. Again, it's in infancy for the discussion, but until the dollars were made available, we really couldn't have these conversations. And as you heard from Senator Warner's discussion, there's a commitment there which gives us new opportunity. But I'm here to talk about big vehicles, including buses. And there have been a number of manufacturers who have come and gone in the transit marketplace because it's a huge undertaking. First, the vehicle. You must have range. And again, this is technical, but we travel hundreds of miles per day on a bus. That means massive batteries. Massive batteries means massive weight. So manufacturers try to trim weight in their chassis, but that can lead to frame cracking, reduced features, and smaller vehicles because you have to have reduced passenger loads. That's kind of the antithesis of that mass transit concept. So what we end up doing, and it's okay, but we sacrifice range unless we can find ways to have mid-trip charging. So that seems reasonable, but A, it's expensive. B, people often don't want the equivalent of a miniature electrical substation in their neighborhoods or in historic locations where frequently lots of people are. So it ends up being a how do we share this space? So you've heard the challenges facing communities and the drive to push forward electric vehicles just on the passenger market, in the individual car ownership market. Think how challenging that would be for us. And as you heard, they hate hills, they hate cold weather. EVs just aren't big fans of that. So that is a challenge within the vehicle. Second, we have cost issues. Replacing a single diesel bus with an electric vehicle is about 1.5 times more expensive per unit. Now, of course, you do have reduced fuel cost. And right now, when you consider the price we're paying for diesel, you could say, okay, that's a benefit. Well, again, you do also have the challenge of an entire fleet has to be charged. Sometimes we would be charging during the peak energy cycle. So you're trying to not only charge a vehicle, you're also trying to do it in peak time periods. And this could be for literally hundreds of heavy duty buses if you're trying to retrofit infrastructure for large fleets. And we tend to put transit fleet locations not always on industrial sites where there's high utility volume. We end up having to pay a small fortune to pipe in that energy and that electricity in terms of the infrastructure. Again, funding down is available now, and that's what we're taking advantage of as an industry. But we are still also burning downstream fossil fuels to create the electricity. Granted, it's cleaner at the smokestack versus the tailpipe. And as you heard from Mr. King, we do have renewable energy feeding into the system. And each year we see improvements in energy efficiency from our renewables, which is fantastic, including solar and wind. There's other issues that have an impact but I really want to focus on solutions, and that's already been alluded to, and that's the development in the marketplace of hydrogen fuel cell buses. We all probably remember science class with some variation of the teacher converting a column of hydrogen into water and generating electricity to move the race car on the track. Some variation of that. Leaders in the transit field are actually migrating away from electric buses into the fuel cell battery bus with hydrogen for the traditional transit fleet. Absolutely, EVs are still in use for city circulators, campus shuttles, and other fleets that can enjoy delayed layover time and have that advantage of top-off charging. Limited route length, limited hours of service, there absolutely is a solution there. But to point out, Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, they're all investing heavily into fuel cell technology. And Shell Oil is right now even experimenting with hydrogen to propel their cargo ships to transport oil into foreign markets. So think about that. We're actually using oil companies are using hydrogen to send oil. So that's an example of where they're looking ahead and trying to figure out how is all of this going to fit. Utility companies are looking into the future and attempting to develop hydrogen hubs right here in Northern Virginia. So this is a massive and developing market. It just doesn't capture the flash and excitement that EVs hold because it's personal vehicles as opposed to the large fleet service and the construction of that large engine marketplace, I guess I should say. I would be remiss if I pointed out that we are already a clean diesel fleet, and you're probably wondering how that is possible. You may not know that the federal government already has required ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, which reduces VOCs or volatile organic compounds. That's been in place for 15, 17 years. So that's already in the marketplace. Secondarily, for about the last 15 years, we've had treatment systems on the diesel vehicle. These are mandated for about a decade, 15 years to help treat emissions to trap particulate matter and reduce the negative impact of burning diesel fuel. And finally, the more passengers we have on the bus, the fewer cars you have on the road. So again, that is baked into our cake. Trimming transit funding forces more driving, which only drives the pollution. And so that's one of our key challenges. And those who are familiar with how we fund transit, especially in Northern Virginia, there's an irony that we fund it through the motor fuels tax, which is reliant on pumping gasoline to generate funds for transit. So the better we do our job as transit providers and transit systems, the less money there actually is for transit. So again, it's a challenge. I hope this has been helpful to kind of understand where the transit industry sits, where we're positioned as an organization. And as you know, this is a very technical issue, and transit systems don't have the same flexibility as maybe your local government fleets, especially when federal funds are at play, and the federal funding rules are its own NVTA session. So we're not going to dive into that. I hope I've hit my 10 to 12 minute mark, and I will turn this back over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bob. Again, I'm Bob McCartney. I'm the moderator. I want to thank Bob and all the speakers for those excellent presentations on this exciting new technology. I guess it's not that new anymore, but this this exciting technology that seems to be gaining critical mass of introducing electrical vehicles, EVs. I got to make a plug here. I'm the host of, since I retired last August from the Washington Post, I've been doing a monthly podcast for the Council of Governments, Jeff King's organization, on regional issues. And it just so happens that the next monthly podcast, which lands on Monday, is all about electric vehicles. So I've just finished editing that yesterday, and I got sort of a crash course in this subject just in time for this discussion today. So everybody be sure to go to the COG website on Monday to hear the podcast on electric vehicles and how local governments are working to try to promote them. So we've heard a lot about the positives and the potential and the importance of electric vehicles in terms of fighting climate change. But there have also been several mentions of some of the challenges. And I think the elephant in the room here, which Bob and Walter both mentioned, the elephant in the room here is some of the technical challenges involving electric vehicles. There's lots of enthusiasm, there's lots of support for them, but we already heard, they have trouble in cold weather. They have trouble going up hills. It takes hours right now to recharge them. Most of the charging stations provide 110 volt services, and that takes hours to fully charge a vehicle usually. We need a lot more 440 volt charging stations so that we can charge them in just a few minutes. And then there's range issues. I mean, it's getting better. The technology's getting better, but people are a little nervous about, running out of juice before they've gone as far as they need to go. And of course, the biggest question, which is being addressed right now, but we've still got a long way to go, is, are there enough charging stations around? They're not anywhere close, until we get to where they're as convenient as gas stations. It's going to be hard, I think, for consumers to really embrace buying them, more, at least consumers other than the sort of eco warriors who are buying them now because they care about the environment and are willing to put up with a lot of inconvenience. So I want to ask each of the speakers to sort of talk about that. I mean, how do we stand in terms of the race between, getting these things, getting the infrastructure up and overcoming consumer resistance? How quickly can the technology improve to sort of really make these widely used? So let's start with Senator Boysko.
Well, thanks, Bob. The federal funds that we have available are, intended to start addressing that. And our hope is that by 2030, we are really going to have a broad implementation of it. I'm going to leave it to the experts on the panel to talk about the technological challenges that we're facing. But unless we pull the trigger and make sure that we are investing in these initiatives instead of just studying them, and we've done a good job of studying them and identifying what the problems are, then we're not going to get where we need to be. Again, we have the opportunity to be the leaders in the country. And I just implore everybody who has a stake in this to push for it so that we can get EVs implement, throughout the state so that people do have the confidence to buy them. This is what the business community wants. It's what the environmental community needs. And it's the best thing for our energy independence as well.
Supervisor Alcorn, what's your view on these technical challenges and where does local government stand in terms of overcoming consumer resistance?
Well, my attitude is, bring on the competition. This is basically a time when, the electric folks are out in front a little bit, but as Bob said in his presentation, there are other companies that are investing in fuel cells, hydrogen. Great, bring it on. I mean, this is, the more the merrier. If we can harness, good old fashioned innovation and competition to bring these technologies to market, all the better. I actually see us I would make the analogy of a time when I wasn't yet totally conscious, the space race. I was born about then, but not quite too far. I'm more of a $6 million man person like Bob. But our government back then invested tremendous resources in getting us to the moon and there were a lot of technical byproducts in a very positive way that came from that. I see the challenge we face with climate on a similar vein, in a similar vein. We don't know ultimately 20, 30 years ago what is going to be the best solution. But frankly, as we can electrify our transit fleets in a way that we know will work, maybe with some changes in processing, maybe with some route changes on our bus systems, that's okay. The challenge is too great for us to wait. And so, as Senator Boysko said, I agree. Let's move forward prudently and where the technology allows, and sort of see if we can thread that needle of not being maybe on the bleeding edge, but at least maybe be a little bit on the cutting edge to implement this and help figure it out for everybody.
I like that, be on the cutting edge, not the bleeding edge. Jeff King from COG, you talked about can you tell us a little bit more about this regional EV deployment plan? I mean, to what extent is that going to help get more charging stations out there and sort of address that challenge of making sure you can get the juice when you need it?
Well, I think only time will tell what it'll bring. Our hope is that, in particular, understanding the actual challenge and the need, and framing that up to the point of having shovel-ready projects, as it were, so that we can go to the federal government or the states when they have the infrastructure funding flowing, and demonstrate that as a region we've coordinated and have identified the number of stations and infrastructure we need and where we want to place them will give us some advantage in terms of competing for those dollars. At this point, it's there are quite a number of charging stations out there, but as you mentioned, a lot of them are kind of the slow chargers. How do we get to the point of getting the fast chargers that we need, where as you mentioned, as convenient as gas stations, and thinking through what is the role of local government in this, and where does the market play? We, for instance, are aware of some advancements coming perhaps from the OEMs. There's a number of auto manufacturers that have announced they're no longer going to make internal combustion engines, and they're moving entirely to electric. As part of that, I think we're probably going to start seeing some changes at a very high level, both from the petroleum industry as well as the automobile industry, in terms of how they offer up the infrastructure. You've already seen in Europe some investments by organizations like Shell in electric vehicle charging stations. So what will the role of the private sector be in that versus the government? But I think currently our biggest opportunity is to organize ourselves around the upcoming opportunity related to the infrastructure funding, and making sure that we can compete nationally in attracting those dollars to invest here in our region.
Right. I think we're definitely getting a certain amount of dollars from the infrastructure bill, and it's a question of trying to get even more. But I think, from what I understand, the federal money for building the new infrastructure network in our region, it's a very good down payment, but it's not enough. It's just a start. There's going to have to be state money, Senator Boysko, and local money as well, in order, plus a lot of changes in regulations and zoning and other things, which Supervisor Alcorn talked about, in order to get enough charging stations set up to really move the needle on this and win over the public. Bob Schneider, I think you're probably as well informed as anybody here about the state of the technology. Can you give us some sense of how quickly the engineers at the manufacturers think that they can address these issues of range and dealing with hills and cold weather and charging time. I mean, how quickly do we think, are we talking about a few years, or are we talking about a decade before some of these technical challenges can get addressed?
I would probably say we're 5 years to a decade. And the reason why is it's really not about the vehicle, it's about the battery. And think about how many things in this world are just powered by a battery, right? So the iPhone didn't emerge until the battery got small enough and could hold up long enough. That's when you saw that technology emerge. So it's the same concept of a personal electronic applies to this vehicle. It's battery life. It's the more you use it, the quicker the battery runs out. The interesting thing for the heavy duty market, though, is in order to get more range, we have to put on more battery. More battery equals more weight. More weight equals the challenge of now the hills are get harder. So gravity can be an enemy of this. But I think something Supervisor Alcorn said is what needs, one of the takeaways that needs to be is it's too important to wait. We will be wading into the EV market through this process through our light and medium duty vehicles. That's a no-brainer. We will also very likely be joining Dash and the DC circulator in local EV buses because it's too important to wait. We don't know when the fuel cell question will emerge. So we're undertaking a study right now to identify which routes have the limited hills, the limited footprint, the very thing that Supervisor Alcorn described that needs to be done. We're doing it. And by the way, Dash did it too. So it's not a scenario where they didn't, they just threw buses out there. They were very, very, very smart about it because we all learned from each other. And that's one of the really unique things about the space race, again, to steal from that example, is we're all in the transit industry. You can only ride one bus at a time. So we're all pushing, trying to find out what that technology and what the solution is. The interesting thing for us will be when the manufacturers decide it's viable, because that's when they'll put the money into their building the fleet, putting in the motors. They're the ones that are going to dictate that viability. And that's what prevents us from being on the bleeding edge. If it's a bleeding edge technology, we're finding oddball companies doing oddball things. It may not be safe, it may not be reliable. Those are things, that's the bleeding edge. The leading edge is when the manufacturers go, okay, we've got it. This is a viable technology, let's go. And then we put not only our mouth, but then we come and ask the state and the local governments for the money. So we can then put our money and our mouth where it belongs. And that's where we'll see the big transition for us.
Thank you. I want to get back to the hydrogen, the question of the potential for hydrogen cells later on in this discussion, and also get to some of the questions, some of the good questions that have been put in the chat box. Keep those coming, folks. But first, I want to address with each of you sort of specific things that you raised in your presentation. And Senator Boysko, I want to ask you about the overall political climate in the state. You pointed out that what you called some downside, that the other party that now controls the governor's mansion and the House is not as enthusiastic, at least at present, in addressing some of these environmental issues as your party, the Democrats. And what struck me about that is you point out the business community is very strongly in favor of this. I mean, for my podcast, I talked to the head of the local Washington area new automobile dealers association. He said the auto dealers are all in on this, are all in on EVs. They're eager to sell EVs. The Washington Auto Show has been emphasizing EVs. As Bob Schneider just mentioned, the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs, the big three car manufacturers, are all saying that they want to switch over to all electric vehicles. So with the business community is in favor of this, and then the environmental community is in favor of this. I mean, shouldn't you be able to harness that to get some support from all political parties and not just your own, Senator Boysko?
Yeah, I mean, Bob, you got a great point there. And I think a lot of it is just around education. the communication that we need to continue to have with our colleagues from other parts of the state who maybe are not following this as closely. We have the business opportunity of a lifetime here to get behind this, and there is huge interest in the private sector, making sure that we're not leaving the more rural parts of Virginia behind. They want to go in and make sure that it's fully implemented in every corner of the state so that everybody has the opportunity to benefit from it. You look at Volvo has a location in Southwest Virginia with the big trucks and buses. That has the opportunity to greatly enhance the economy of those areas down there. We have the headquarters of Volkswagen right here, who are leading the charge in saying that this has to be changed. And as we have discussed, the auto dealers are also, speaking with one voice, saying this is the wave of the future. I think that we've got to continue to have conversations with our governor and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to make sure that they understand that this is a win-win for everyone. Sometimes they get caught up in the political challenges of preserving oil and coal-fired energy, and I think we just have to get past that and realize that that's really not the conversation to have any longer. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you. Supervisor Alcorn, you talked about the whole question of homeowners associations and the fact that most people are still charging their EVs, the ones who have the EVs. By the way, it's just under 5% in the greater Washington area, not just Northern Virginia, but also including the district and suburban Maryland. The total number of all electric vehicles is just over 20,000. And the number of hybrids, I have two of my own, is 150,000, and that's about that's just under 5% of the cars out there right now in the greater Washington area. So there's a long way to go, but it's a good start, and there's been a huge increase in all electric vehicles and hybrids in the last few years. Those are all according to COG numbers, by the way. But Supervisor Alcorn, you said that most people who do have these all electric vehicles, they're charging them at home. And if you live in an apartment building that maybe doesn't have electric charging stations in its garage yet, or if you live in a homeowners association estate, if you will, then maybe they don't really allow for this kind of thing. So what can local governments do in order to help overcome that hurdle? And what kind of help? You mentioned you might need some help from Senator Boysko and her colleagues in the legislature there. Talk about what the local governments can do and what kind of help you might need from the state.
Thank you for the question. You know, one of the reasons I really love local government is in local government, you have to be practical. You really can't escape, the implementation of anything like this. And that's important in this context and the question you asked, Bob, because we're still figuring it out in terms of how to help folks get charging in their townhouse communities, in their apartment complexes, because it is a little bit complicated. It may very well be that well, first of all, let me step back and say one role that local government can play is to make sure that our zoning ordinances don't inhibit the placement of charging stations in our residential neighborhoods. In Fairfax County, we recently updated our zoning ordinance and established updated regulations so that basically you can't put a charging station in a fire lane, things like that, but otherwise it is now allowed throughout Fairfax County in all residential areas. So that's one thing that local government can do is basically make sure we're not restricting the implementation of these charging stations where they need to be. The other role that certainly we're starting to play in Fairfax County and had some discussions with our OECC, our Office of Energy Conservation and Climate. We really need to raise awareness amongst our homeowners associations on the opportunities that are out there, both public sector and private sector, to finance and to facilitate the implementation of charging stations. That's easier said than done. Anybody that's ever been president of their homeowners association knows that, you got to worry about parking lot repaving and, the finances and trash pickup. And, you got a lot of things you're worrying about. Somebody shows up and says, I want a charging station. Well, you just add it to the list, right? So that's something that I think helping provide the information that's needed is going to be important for local government to do. There may also be a more direct role eventually in terms of being local government being a conduit for public funds to these homeowners associations. It might end up coming directly from the state through grants, but there are already some programs in place that through various local government agencies that might be appropriate conduits. And again, this is all focusing on the personal vehicles. And, what Bob talked about earlier, he's right. I mean, fleets, you got to look at those totally differently, and the challenges with the battery technology and the improvements that need to be. I mean, Fairfax County, we got trash trucks too. We got basically semis that run on diesel right now. And so you kind of have to think about the entire fleet whenever, not just the things that look more like the vehicles that we own personally. So anyway, long answer to your short question.
Thank you. It sounds like from the legislature to the homeowners association, the key is education. Now I want to go Jeff King from COG. I wonder if you could talk about, COG is all about regional cooperation. I wonder if you could talk about regional cooperation, talk more about what you said about regional cooperation and getting maybe purchases of electric vehicles. I mean, could we get a discount if everybody in the region went in together? Could we get discounts on buying electric buses or electric trash trucks? And I'll throw in one of the good questions we got from the chat box from Tracy Baynard. What activities, if coordinated on the regional level, would help transition our transit bus fleets to low emission fuels?
Yeah, so there's, and so folks know, one of the key benefits of organization like COG is our ability to organize around cooperative purchasing. And you're right that if you can scale up demand and approach the market with a larger offering, you can get better terms and pricing. And this is done, on commodities like road salt and diesel fuel. And COG has a long history of doing cooperative purchasing. In our governmental contracts, there's something known as the COG rider clause. So we always encourage our members and organizations like WMATA and our transit agencies, when they're doing procurement, to always add that COG rider clause to their contract, so that if they obtain a good deal, that our other government members can share in that benefit. And one thing that to keep in mind too is that governments tend to have a very long procurement cycle. And so if one government body already has gone through that long, arduous process of finding a vendor and competitively securing a contract, and others can kind of immediately ride that, it can save 6 months or a year or more of bureaucracy to get a contract in place. So there's definitely a precedent for that concept. Back in, God, it must have been 2015 or so, more than 4 or 5 years ago, there was a federal grant opportunity that we were involved with. There were 2 main players that received the grant support from the Department of Energy. In our case, the sister grant team was the state of California with other state entities. And in our case, it was a grant team called Fleets for the Future. which specifically we were getting grant funding to figure out, can we do cooperative procurement of vehicles and infrastructure? And, a lot of effort went into organizing. I think the challenge at the time, and probably still the challenge, is that when you're talking to government fleet owners and operators, and I'd be interested in Bob's perspective on this, Fairfax County may want to purchase this year a particular set of SUVs for the police fleet, and Prince George's County this year may need some pickup trucks for the DPW. And so getting all of our local government members to, on any given year, have the same set of interest and need for particular vehicles, it's hit or miss. I think in concept, if all of our government members said we need, 10,000 Chevy Bolts or something, I suspect GM would step up and give us a better deal. But the challenge of getting that kind of organized procurement need at a given point in time is a bit challenging. The other piece related to Tracy's question on the chat, and it's related, is right now in some, and we've even heard this a little bit from Wanata, as excited as they are to sell the vehicles, as folks may have heard, supply chain issues, semiconductor chip issues, that there's has been in the last 6 months or a year kind of a shortage of available supply to meet demand. And so as much as we may want to purchase 10,000 Chevy Bolts this year, can they actually supply that many vehicles is a big question. My hope would be that supply issue will solve itself on the OEM side over time. And I think the concept's still worth looking at. I think perhaps one thing that we may see that I've heard rumor of is that there may be some new kind of packaging of the infrastructure offering where you have OEMs teaming with vendors to offer kind of straight from factory pricing levels for some of the infrastructure we may need. I don't know exactly how that'll play out. I think certainly if that type of package deal is offered, that could make a big difference, where you have both the supply of vehicles and associated charging infrastructure coming kind of straight from the OEM factory at a discounted price. It could make a difference. I think once we see the infrastructure funding ramp up to the extent that there is supply, I would have to think that bundling our demand and seeking better pricing from the market makes a lot of sense.
Jeff is doing my job for me. He asked Bob the question. I'm just going to pass it on. How would a group like yours, OmniRide, do you think it's realistic for you to cooperate with other jurisdictions, other transit agencies, to go in cooperatively on buying EVs?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, we've been doing it OmniRide's been doing it for 20 years or more, in that we frequently don't do our own solicitations for buses. We buy off of either a state contract or we partner with other agencies. So frequently we buy our commuter coaches. Let's see, we've partnered with, I believe it's the Grand Forks Transportation Authority. Our most recent purchase is coming off the Washington State procurement. So one of the interesting things about that is we can then dip into other leading states or other leading procurements that allows for that bulk pricing. Now, it's not 10,000 transit buses, but it may be 4 and 6 depending on the year, because we don't want our whole fleet to come to at one time, right? That's bad planning to have the roof on your house, your driveway, your air conditioning, and your plumbing to all go at the same time. You don't want that. So we plan a little bit differently. What is really the key is having the available procurements, for example, at the state level, having state contracts that we can buy into. So when we're ready to acquire staff vehicles, or we're ready to acquire a medium duty pickup truck for our maintenance department, having not only the vehicle on the procurement, but having the charging station on a statewide procurement, it makes it much easier. It's less technically difficult to just go ahead and make that purchase, especially for the small governments. They can see the biggest change quickly because they're able to then buy that individual market. So to really talk about what Senator Boysko described is, there's a lot of incentives that could be done for small towns, cities all across Virginia that maybe only have 30, 40 vehicles in their fleet. If you're able to not only severely discount the cost of the charging station, but you're severely discounting the cost of the vehicle, and now your charging is limited, what better incentive can you have for a small community that doesn't have the tax base? So there really are things we can do, and back to that concept of education. We have to be willing to spend the dollars to send your technical team someplace to study. You have to be willing to spend the money on whether it's a small scale study or having your engineering facility team look ahead. And I'll also say this from the private or from the transit market. So Supervisor Alcorn, what I want you to do is I want you to drive to the transit lot, plug in your car and get free fuel, ride around with me all day, and then ride home. So you're pretty much fully charged, right? So there are things that we can do in the marketplace that we, the public leaders and public officials, we can plug in, we can build the charging infrastructure at places where we want people to go, and then plug them into the transit network. So you're really getting the double charge there. You're getting the benefit of getting people, there's an incentive to convert, and secondarily, while their vehicle is charging, they're able to go where they need to go on a transit vehicle. So you're reducing miles traveled, you're reducing pollution, you're taking advantage, you're putting, as we love to say at OmniRide, cheeks in seats. Those are things that are all important that helps make the difference, not just within like a region like Northern Virginia, but this applies in Roanoke, this applies in Bristol. So there's no reason these concepts can't stretch into every part of Virginia and beyond.
Okay, thanks. We've got about 12 minutes left, and we still have several things to cover. I wonder if each of you, I'm going to reverse the order here and start with Schneider and go backwards. Talk a little bit about what about the hydrogen, the possibility of the hydrogen technology becoming actually, a big alternative to battery-powered electric vehicles, or even becoming the dominant. I've heard some people say they think ultimately the hydrogen burning vehicles are going to win the contest ultimately, versus EVs. And I had this sort of, I'm a retired journalist. I'm a recovering journalist, and so I ask difficult questions. I mean, I have this sort of negative vision of, we spend years investing in electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure, and then everybody decides that hydrogen is actually the way to go, and we have to do a whole nother giant technological transition just in a matter of 20 years. So what about the prospect of hydrogen actually becoming the dominant technology? Bob Schneider.
So I'm going to put on my supervillain hat for a minute. And I think you're dealing with two questions. One is who profits from making the electric vehicle? Ford, Chevy, BMW, Daimler. Who profits from hydrogen? Shell, ExxonMobil, et cetera. I think both things will happen, but very differently, which is why I described the gasoline versus the diesel. I think what you may see two different things happening at the same time. You might see electric vehicles lay side by side with the hydrogen fuel market, because ultimately, if we stop drilling for oil and we stop pumping oil, what is Shell going to do? Right? Again, I'm putting on my evil super villain hat. How are they going to make money? Right? What is Houston going to do? The H in Houston might stand for hydrogen by the time this is done. Let's not forget, we're also at our house, we have electricity, but many people heat their home with natural gas, right? It's not as if there's only one energy form out there. We've got multiple energy forms that we can take advantage of. And that also gives us the concept of then you have redundancy. So if you do have issues with your electrical grid, You have a security redundancy of a hydrogen system. So there's different things at play. And one thing I do want to point out, it was the conversation about, replacing your trash trucks, things like that. Right now, your local landfill is burning methane. It is burning pollution out of the landfill. There's around the country, landfills are now filtering that, cleaning it, and putting it into the natural gas pipeline. So there's a lot of different places we can find energy. And that's why when we do our study, I frequently make jokes about the flux capacitor, because we have no idea what that future energy system will be, right? Let's not forget there is nuclear, but of course there's environmental concerns. We're going to be chasing a lot of different things. But again, my supervillain hat tells me that, like Elon Musk isn't in it to sell cars. He's in it to sell energy. He's in it to transfer energy into your vehicle. And if he can sell on the front end and the back end, he wins. And so that's one of the things that I really look to, is to see how will the private sector invest its development and how will they spend their money. And then we will sit back and understand, okay, this is where it's going because it's commercially viable and it's reliable. And I keep using the word marketplace because that's very, very real.
Well, that's quite an interesting construction. The automakers are going for EVs and the oil companies are going for hydrogen, and who's going to win? Put your bets down now, folks. Jeff, what does COG think about this? I have the impression that even if hydrogen ultimately is going to win, the available technology right now favors focus on EVs, and given the importance of doing something about climate change, that's what we should be focusing on. Do I have that right?
So, couple thoughts here. One is related to hydrogen in our region. I put in the chat a link to the Connected DMV, is an organization that was formed a year or two ago, and they have started the concept of a hydrogen center. And when you talk to the folks leading the effort, they at this point are thinking quite broadly across the whole spectrum of the possibilities. We're talking today about electric vehicles, but I just heard mention of nuclear. So as part of, let's say, the supply side of hydrogen, if you look at the nuclear plants supplying power for our region, to the extent that they have waste thermal energy that's not used from their process that can be used to create hydrogen on site, might that be something to look at in terms of a market development? And it wouldn't necessarily be used in vehicles, but it would help decarbonize our grid in association with hydrogen. I think there's the other concept as it relates to electric vehicles is, when I was in Stuttgart, Germany back in 2016 with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, meeting with leading automotive engineers and talking to them about electric vehicles versus hydrogen, they were pretty clear that they thought hydrogen had a big role in the future. And if you think about it, hydrogen for vehicles isn't combusted, it's used as a fuel cell. And for those who are not familiar with that technology, fuel cells basically send hydrogen through a membrane, and it creates electricity and water. So you're not only dealing with climate change, but you're really also reducing all of the emissions associated with smog and ozone and fine particulates. But the system is an electricity-based system. So if the automobile sector moves to an electric platform, there's still potentially a role for hydrogen fuel cells to be slid in when the market is ready. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You could actually see the move to electrification as the stepping stone to get us to hydrogen in some sense. So I think it could have a role on the power production side. I know Dominion's quite interested in it and looking closely at it. Connected DMV folks are real interested in it. And if you look at places like Germany, that are phasing out all of the nuclear power plants, and by mid 2030s are going to close all their coal plants. They're looking very seriously at using renewables like wind to generate green hydrogen to put into the pipelines to power their industry. So I think there's definitely some interesting developments on the hydrogen front, and I think there'll be a role, as Bob pointed out. When you see partnerships like Houston, Texas, where I was born and raised, and companies like Exxon teaming up to get into the hydrogen market and carbon sequestration market, that's a pretty huge development. So I think there'll be some interesting times to come on the hydrogen front.
Well, I'm very happy to hear you suggest that maybe the hydrogen and the electric vehicles are not mutually exclusive. Okay, we're closing in on the end here. I'm going to ask the two elected officials to take us out. First Supervisor Alcorn, and then Senator Boysko. And you can talk about hydrogen, or you can talk about, whatever you think the important takeaway is from this whole discussion.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for calling on Bob and Jeff before me on the hydrogen question, because honestly, there are a lot of different things in play. I would just point out, and Jeff made this point quite well. I think whatever solution we go to, whatever technology, we have to remember, specifically for electricity and for hydrogen, those are things that have to be produced by something. So let's make sure we're looking upstream, make sure we're understanding that whatever fuel choice we're going to use in technology, that there's at least a path to making that renewable or zero emissions, so that the entire system is zero emissions and not just the visible stuff that we see. So, and I would just finish on, I think this is super helpful to have these conversations. There's such an important role for coordination across many different levels here, the operator level, the local level, state level, federal level, and having this good information flow and understanding, and frankly, common strategies and opportunistic strategies as well, to take advantage of where the technology is there and sharing information. I think this is super helpful as we work through this common goal of zero emissions in our transportation sector. So thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Senator Boysko, you can take us out with whatever comments you want to make here at the end. Maybe the takeaway, most important takeaways from this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a pleasure to talk with you all today. And I can remember working in the early 1990s, where I sat on a commission that was looking at alternative vehicles back, where we were talking about compressed natural gas, hydrogen, electric vehicles, and it's exciting to see that we are really at the cusp of real change at this point. One of the things that I think is important is that we continue to communicate with our leaders that this is good for the economy, it's good for our national security. Our new Secretary of Transportation, Shep Miller, is an expert in transportation, and I am hopeful to have him as an ally, as well as our Governor Youngkin, who I know will understand the business sense in all of this. But it's been a real pleasure to talk to you all and to be a part of this. So thank you so much. And I look forward to our continued conversations together as we move forward on this. Appreciate you having me.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists. This is the time to end. I apologize to people who submitted questions in the chat box that I did not get to. I just felt like there were a lot of things to cover. It's a very complicated and fast-moving story. Couple of people have told me that the auto manufacturers are saying that the next 5 years we will see the biggest changes in the automobile industry in our lifetimes. Really, the biggest changes are coming in the next few years since Henry Ford introduced the Model T. I do not think that's an exaggeration, based on the promise of the electric vehicles and the possibly hydrogen fueled ones. So now I will pass it back to NVTA's Mackenzie Love.
Thank you, Bob. And I did want to mention quickly for all those folks who put in those questions that we will be doing, we'll be working to answer those or respond to them in one way or the other. So please keep your eyes out for that because they were all such interesting thoughts you shared. I also wanted to thank Bob and the panel again for such a in-depth discussion. It is just a pleasure to have such a well-versed moderator and an impressive group of panelists discuss the nuances of electrification, as well as the potential challenges that we are or will be facing, and balance against the potential benefits there, and what we can do to maximize the good of that technology. With that, I'd like to ask for our attendees' feedback and input once more through another polling point. And again, just if you haven't registered yet, please text VNVTA 068 to the number 22333. If you've already done that this morning, you don't need to do it again. And then you'll be able to participate via text message. With that, wow, got answers already. With that, the next question for you all is, which one of the following factors is most important to you when deciding whether to buy or lease an electric vehicle or EV as your next vehicle? And to respond, please send a text message to that same number with one of these letters associated with the answer you'd like to submit. While you all are considering how to respond to this question and engaging with it, I would like to reflect back on our first poll this morning when we asked you if you would be likely or how likely you would be to consider leasing or purchasing an electric vehicle. And 35% of you indicated that you would be somewhat or that you would be very or extremely likely. So now we'll be looking more into the reasons that would inform those decisions. I'm going to give it another minute for answers to come in. I know there might be a delay for folks on YouTube, and I want to make sure everyone gets the chance to participate. Again, if you need to change your answer, just type the word undo into your text box, and it will allow you to respond again. It's always wonderful to see these come in real time and engage with you all this way. It's a really exciting aspect of this event. Okay, looks like our numbers are starting to stabilize here, and we are seeing that by a substantial lead, the biggest factor that you all will be considering in whether or not you would purchase or lease an electric vehicle is certainty of being able to charge that vehicle at convenient times and locations, which I think really goes along with a lot of the points that our panelists brought up in the last session. So that's good to see that our leaders are in tune with what some of those needs might be, even through this informal poll. Great. So that was a lot of fantastic content, both in this poll and from the panel. And I think it would be a good time to take a break for everyone. And so with that, we will move into a 10-minute break for attendees. And I will put a little handy timer on your screen there so that you can look back at any point and quickly see when we will be bringing more content to you. With that, please feel free to stretch, grab some coffee, get ready for more information coming your way. And we'll be back with you shortly. Thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. Just doing some welcoming remarks. No content being shared at this time, but I did want to welcome Greg Rogers to the meeting. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
Hey, Mackenzie, I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be joining you all today.
Thanks, Greg. Looking forward to seeing you on the next panel. Feel free to grab yourself coffee as well.
Thank you. I will be well caffeinated.
I would also like to welcome Miss Dahlia Levin. I believe she joined us also. How are you today, Dahlia?
I'm doing all right, Mackenzie. Can you hear me?
Yes, sounding and coming through clearly on video and audio. Thank you.
Great.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. This is Mackenzie Love again. I hope that you all are feeling refreshed and ready for another round of exciting content. All right. Looks like everyone is with us again. So we're ready to move on to our next panel now, which is titled Nova Innovates, and our speakers will be covering an array of innovative transportation solutions that are being developed now from several different locations. So that is going to be exciting to hear some of the possibilities coming our way. With that, I would like to ask you all for your insight on innovation as well. So we'll do another live poll, and we encourage you to participate via text message again. The question for you that I'd like to pose to you all is, what innovative transportation solution would you personally be most interested in seeing Northern Virginia explore further? In this case, it is a free response poll, and so we'd encourage you to use either a single word, an acronym, or a hyphenated word, because these will show up as a word cloud on your screen. So if there are any spaces, they might show up as two different entries to the word cloud. So I'd encourage things like EV could be used to indicate you're interested in exploring electrification, electric vehicles, or AV for autonomous vehicles. Okay, I see you all are starting to submit a few things, and it seems to be working well. I'll give you a couple of minutes to respond here. Great, so we're seeing, okay, so I'm seeing some things about biking, electric bikes in particular, but also some focus on innovations in transit like BRT. There's also some focus on information sharing, which kind of underpins a lot of different technologies and empowers them to really achieve their maximum potential. So that's very important. Looks like a couple of folks are also mentioning hydrogen, so taking some inspiration possibly from our first panel today. Multimodal trips. Okay, that goes along well with what MBTA is interested in pursuing. So we're glad to see that we're in alignment there. I'm catching more things about different propulsion technologies, folks interested in hydrogen and electrification, or other, electrifying the roads perhaps. So looking at different ways to move away from your traditional internal combustion engine. Okay, some things about behavioral changes in regards to transportation, like encouraging teleworking, and making sure that our school zones are safe so that when individuals are using our transportation system across the region, they're safe in doing so and have those options. All right, incentives, someone mentioned that also goes along with travel behaviors and how those might change as technologies enter the region. And apps can also provide information to travelers so they can make informed decisions, or perhaps they could be provided those incentives that someone else mentioned. So a lot of these things, while they're using slightly different wording or different approaches, they kind of synergize or harmonize together around similar topics, which really seem to be providing multimodal options for our region, keeping up with new innovations about propulsion technologies, and that would be things like electrification, hydrogen, or different ways of powering our vehicles, regardless of their purpose, and also staying up to date on the needs and desires of our community in regards to their travel behaviors, be it through information through apps, providing incentives, making sure there are options like teleworking and safe access to schools. And I'm also seeing a few folks touch on things like autonomous vehicles and keeping abreast of those new developments that could completely revolutionize the way we travel. All right, I think that is, I think we're starting to see the end of the responses there. So thank you all for the thought that you put into this. It's really interesting for us to see what you think is a priority and what you're interested in. And with that, and maybe it will be an interesting point for our panel to reflect on as well. With that, I will hand it over to Keith Jasper, who will introduce our next round of panelists.
Thanks, Mackenzie. I have no idea how you managed to read that word cloud in real time and provide an interpretation and an overlay of what we're doing at MBTA all at the same time. So congrats on that, and thanks for everyone for your responses. This next panel is really kind of gets to the heart of how we created the Roundtable series in the first place. Innovation in transportation technology has always been a huge focus. It was never the case that we thought we would do this every year, but after the first year, we decided that there was so much interest and more importantly, so much change just in the space of 1 year that we could keep hosting an event focused on transportation technology and never really revisit the same information, or if we revisited the same projects, they'd be at a further stage of deployment. Northern Virginia, or NOVA, as we like to say up here, is all about innovation, and NOVA is at the heart of innovation. And we know this to be a true fact because, as you can see from the title on the slide here, that's the letters NOVA are at the heart of the word innovates. And so with that, we have 4 fantastic innovators to cover some very wide-ranging topics in this panel. As previously, I'm not going to go into individuals' bios. They are posted on the event website, but please do take a look. What I would like to kind of introduce people in the reverse order we'll be hearing from them. So starting with Greg Rogers, who's the Public Policy Manager at Neuro. If you don't know what Neuro does, you're about to find out. I would mention that the first time I kind of met Greg was when he worked for an organization called SAFE. SAFE stands for Securing America's Future Energy, and there are some titans of the transportation industry who are members of SAFE, but the thing that has always been left with me is the number of retired admirals and generals who are members of SAFE, and talking to them about preserving the supply chains for oil is really insightful when they talk about energy dependence for the United States. Kathy McGee, her title says innovation, doesn't really need much more of an introduction than that, but I will add that Kathy was slated to speak at this roundtable 2 years ago. I think the night before the event, she called us up and said, "I'm not coming." But the reason she gave for not coming was because the governor required her participation in the Commonwealth's initial response to the pandemic. So Kathy, we're glad to finally get you here to speak this morning. And Kathy is an absolutely wonderful partner with MBTA on a major initiative she's going to talk about during her remarks. Alison De Sereno is our truly out-of-state guest today, and it's not Saturday night live from New York. It's Wednesday morning live from Northern Virginia. But Alison is going to talk about something that we as transportation planners talk about a lot, pricing and initiatives. Alison, however, works for an organization which is actually going to be doing this pretty soon. So this is really interesting to see how that goes on such a politically sensitive topic. And kicking off the panel this morning, Dahlia Levin, who probably gets the award for the longest title. And she is actually works for Cambridge Systematics, although I'd say that the fact that Cambridge is our sponsor is not the reason she was invited. Dahlia is helping to lead up a lot of the work that MBTA is currently doing in updating its long-range plan transaction and our 6-year program, which is how we fund projects in Northern Virginia. Dahlia is a great resource. She has a great manner with our committees, which is wonderful because she spends a lot of time with them. So with that, Dahlia, I'll hand over to you.
I should turn my video on now so you can all see me laughing at Keith's description. So thank you all for having me. I'm glad to see you all. I think what I'm going to talk about today is going to be how we're incorporating some of this upcoming innovation that we've all been talking about today into that transaction long-range planning process. So we're really going to talk, and I'm going to go as quickly as I can, about how we're incorporating scenario planning and sort of why we're incorporating scenario planning into the long-range planning process. So for those of you who are not fully aware, Transaction is the long-range transportation plan for Northern Virginia. And one of the key elements of this plan is a performance-based evaluation of potential transportation improvements. And, you know, as we've discussed, NVTA is truly multimodal. So we look at all sorts of projects, everything from highway widenings to interchange conversions to ITS projects to trails, sidewalks, bike share projects, anything you can really think of gets incorporated into Transaction. And we're primarily looking at model-based analysis of the potential future impacts of those projects. And a lot of what we're looking at is how will these projects impact congestion? How will they impact accessibility around the region? How might they impact resiliency? And those are some of the key elements that have been identified as sort of goals, transportation goals for the region. And you'll notice that I said we're using a model, so a travel demand model. But I'll admit, as a travel demand modeler myself, those techniques really only account for one version of the future. And it's typically based off of trends that we've seen in the past. And as you can imagine, given all of the innovation that is coming, that one version of the future doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And so on the next slide is really how we're incorporating that uncertainty into that transaction process. So instead of simply relying on that one version of the future, we are looking at multiple future scenarios. So right now, we're looking at 3 plausible futures. And again, these are plausible. These are not necessarily preferred futures. These are not necessarily the predicted futures. Because as you'll see when I start talking about them, these could all happen simultaneously in pieces. So we're just trying to look at what are the forces that could be changing that future and therefore change the impacts that projects could have in that future. So we've developed 3 plausible future scenarios, and these are assumption-based scenarios. So they incorporate sort of measures and proxy elements that represent how the future could change. So how the transportation network could change, how people's decision-making patterns could change, given some of these future innovations. And what we want to use these for is to understand how uncertainty might impact the transportation needs in the region, the opportunities we see in the region. So understanding what different impacts might be. And in particular, because NVTA is looking at, you know, making investments in particular improvements in particular projects, is understanding which of those improvements are likely to be necessary in all the future scenarios, and thereby sort of help NVTA and the jurisdictions help avoid investment obsolescence, which is a long phrase for saying we want to make sure we're investing things that will be useful no matter what. And so I'm going to do a quick review of the 3 scenarios that we're looking at right now. What I'm really enjoying about this is watching that word cloud forum that Mackenzie was orchestrating earlier. You can see that a lot of those things are actually incorporated in these scenarios. So the first scenario we're looking at, because it's 2020 and we have to, is a post-pandemic new normal, which is really trying to get at the question of what if some of these trends that we've observed during the pandemic continue into the long-term future. So a lot of things about what if the telework increases at the level, to the level we've been seeing during the pandemic or something close to it. That would be a significant disruption in the long term and would have significant impacts on congestion levels, on transit ridership, on all of those things that we model and analyze. We want to think about replacing some of those shopping trips with deliveries, because we are all of us guilty of ordering all those things online, and it is very convenient. And then we also want to consider here the increases in non-motorized travel. And this is things like walking, which we've seen a lot more people doing as they're sticking closer to home during the day. They're able to walk to more things, but also looking at bicycles, both privately owned bicycles, the shared bikes, e-bikes, all of that, making sure that we're capturing those increases as well. The second scenario that we're looking at is a technology scenario, which may or may not be misnamed because there's technology throughout all 3 of these. But the focus here is what if the connected, automated, shared, and electric vehicles, which somebody much cleverer than I came up with a great acronym for, become really prevalent across Northern Virginia. And so what we're looking at here is these connected, automated, shared vehicles, all of which would be electric. So these case vehicles available across the region for people to make their trips. We want to see connected and automated trucks as well. We want to see some of these automated shuttles that we have a couple of demonstrations of in Virginia, but we've seen across the country as well. What if those are implemented, helping make those first mile, last mile connections to transit, to key destinations? There's been a lot of discussion around connected automated vehicles and their potential to help sort of realize increased roadway throughput, so effective capacity increasing on our existing roadways, helping to deal with some of the congestion issues here in Northern Virginia. But these vehicles and this business model that comes with them, of them being shared, also has some changes to travel patterns we want to make sure we're thinking about. So we're talking here about additional driving trips made by primarily folks who can't drive or who choose not to drive. So we're looking at young folks, right, under the driving age, who might be able to drive, folks with a disability who might not have been able to drive themselves before, the elderly, things like that. But we're also looking at people who might be willing to make much longer trips. If you were able to sleep or work or watch cat videos in your car while you drive, how much longer might you be willing to commute on a daily basis? And then also making sure we're capturing these zero occupancy vehicle trips, which is one of my new favorite acronyms, ZOV trips that would be caused by these vehicles either relocating to a park, driving to pick up their next passengers. And so this, in some sense, is similar to what we've seen from Uber and Lyft as they, go to pick up their next passengers. They sort of circulate around some of the neighborhoods. So we want to make sure we're considering that as well, because not all of these have purely positive impacts. And then the third scenario we're looking at, which we also saw it pop up in our word cloud, was looking at pricing and incentives. And how that could really impact behavior choices. And so what if we had these types of pricing and incentive mechanisms that could manage travel demand? And so these would be things like VMT pricing across the region, which would necessitate some technology in order to implement changes to parking and curbside pricing in order to incentivize different travel behaviors. There's been a lot of talk in recent months and in the last 2 years in particular about making transit free. So what if we had fare-free transit across the region? And then there's also been discussions about just providing incentives to help manage congestion. So incentives to shift travel times outside of those peak hours so that we could manage our congestion better. All of these things require different types of technologies, different types of solutions to make them possible. But what we're really looking here from a modeling perspective is how does it change travel behaviors? And then how do those result in different sort of operations of the transportation system? What are the impacts of those? And so in the next couple of months, we'll actually be able to come out with those results and share them all with you guys. And that's all I have for now.
Thanks so much, Dahlia. Alison, over to you.
Right. Can you guys see me now? I think so. Thank you, Keith. So it's an honor to be here today. I'd like to just take a moment to thank NVTA and ITS Virginia for providing the opportunity to speak with you and for all of you being here. As Keith mentioned, I'm Alison de Serrano, Deputy Chief Operating Officer at New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority. For those who may not be as familiar with MTA, just to set some context, we're North America's largest transportation network. We have 5 operating agencies, and prior to COVID, we were moving 9 million people each day on our subways, buses, and rail. And even now, during COVID, we're still over 5 million as we're recovering. And in 2021, and this is important for today's discussion, we moved over 800,000 vehicles daily on our bridges and tunnels. And in essence, our roadway traffic through our bridges and tunnels is already close to 95% of the pre-COVID levels. And importantly, what we've seen is that on any given day, it's different groups of people, which means if everyone were really traveling every day, we'd probably be well past where we were prior to COVID. So today I'm going to talk to you about our congestion pricing program. I'm going to focus, I could speak for hours on it. There's a lot of information, but given the focus of today on innovation, I'm really going to focus on the various ways in which we're paving the way, pun fully intended, for our region and others to follow. Next slide, please. So why New York and why now? Right? Congestion pricing isn't a new concept. In fact, value pricing, congestion pricing goes all the way back in this country to the 1970s. It's been implemented over the years in London, Stockholm, Singapore, and other cities around the world. There are a number of cities that are assessing the potential for congestion pricing here in the United States. And some of you may recall that New York City actually tried to implement a plan back in 2007. They had federal support for it at the time, but did not have state support for it. So in many ways, we're fortunate right now. Our industry is at a convergence of, in essence, need and opportunity. New York City and the surrounding area, like many urban centers, is at a breaking point with vehicle congestion. It's stifling growth and it's affecting our environment. At the same time, our transit systems need significant reinvestment to address aging infrastructure, increased demand, and now some new needs. And with new and advanced technologies, congestion pricing really allows us a holistic approach to addressing the challenges. The program, which we refer to as Central Business District Tolling Program, and I'm just going to use the acronym for the rest of the discussion, CBDTP, is innovative in multiple ways. The project itself is innovative, first of its kind in the United States, and importantly, unlike many other similar implementations around the world, CBDTP doesn't aim to only reduce traffic congestion, but to also raise sufficient revenues to support transit investments in order to further reduce that congestion. The technology and infrastructure I'm going to talk about in a little bit are also innovative in themselves. They're designed to fit within an urban landscape. And suffice it to say, you'll see in a few minutes that this is not your traditional toll system. And it builds for the future by including the ability for third-party providers to interface with our primary toll system. We've also been innovating the process as we move through this process with Federal Highway Administration. We quickly came to realize that while the value pricing pilot program, under which this will be authorized if it receives approval, has been used for numerous studies for some years now, but this is actually the first program that's going to be implemented that actually tests the VPPP. And given the size of the effort, and as a result of COVID happening right around the same time, we've also had to engage with the public in ways that are not typical. And we've had some real success with that. So I'll talk to that a little bit as well. Thank you. So to kind of situate everybody, since not everyone may be familiar with exactly what this looks like, a couple of things. First, at the outset, many folks are familiar around the country with the benefits of managed lanes as a congestion management technique. We often talk about, and you just heard a moment ago, in fact, that we want to push the traffic to the shoulders. We want to push it into the off-peak. While we're looking to do some of that, a key difference with this program is we're not just looking to push people to the off-peak. We're actually looking to push those who can get out of their cars and onto transit. So in April 2019, New York State enacted the MTA Reform and Traffic Mobility Act to authorize MTA's Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority to design, develop, build, and ultimately operate the CBDTP. And what you have here are some of the key features of it. As I mentioned, the goals are to reduce congestion, enhance mobility, raise net revenues sufficient to generate $15 billion for the MTA's 2020 to 2024 capital program. The key features, as I just mentioned, TBTA is in charge of designing it, installing, constructing, and operating, and maintaining. And we're working in close coordination with New York City Department of Transportation, since it is their roadways on which we will be putting our toll equipment. We have mandated periods in the legislation for public outreach, 60 days before go live, for system testing, which anyone who's ever done any sort of electronic system before recognizes we were thrilled to actually have this mandated, because the more testing, the better off we are. So it's 30 days before go live. And tolls collected, but no assessment of violation fees for the first 60 days afterwards. That actually came after our experience implementing all electronic tolling and how many people were really confused by this new way of doing things with invoicing in the mail. And so they'll have this leeway for 2 months, in essence, to get used to this new system before we start putting any fees on. And just to be clear, since we do use different language in different places, fees meaning for people who are violating, who aren't paying their tolls. We're required to only charge passenger vehicles once per day for entering or remaining in the central business district. And there are 2 exemptions that are required by legislation, one for qualifying authorized emergency vehicles and another for qualifying vehicles transporting persons with disabilities. And in recognition of the fact that we will be setting up a new toll system and there are people of low income who reside in the central business district, those who have who make less than $60,000 a year annually will be allowed a tax credit from New York State. Thank you. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, while the program is innovative in itself, the infrastructure and system are as well. The Central Business District tolling program charges vehicles a toll for entering or remaining on or below 60th Street in Manhattan, excluding the West Side Highway, and FDR Drive. And so on the map to the right, you'll see the FDR Drive actually runs around the east side of Manhattan, and the West Side Highway, no surprise, runs along the west. So as long as you stay on that outer perimeter, in essence, you would not be charged a toll. To do this, we're putting toll detection points at entrances and exits to and from the Central Business District. They're primarily used to detect the vehicles so that we can see when they're coming and when they're leaving. For those who may be familiar with our area, this is a huge swath of property here with intersections in numerous locations, especially down this West Side Highway. It's roughly every 4 to 5 blocks you can enter or exit from the Central Business District in this area. And then down the FDR Drive, it's a little more like highway, but there are still numerous exit and entrance points. So what we're doing is we're setting up an algorithm for those who are coming down the side roads. Rather than put roughly 100 more detection points it would have required, we're going to use an algorithm that in essence watches the regular traffic and determines how long it should take to get from one point to the next point to the next point. And the idea is that if we see you at the first point and we know traffic should be about 10 minutes for the next point, when we see roughly 10 minutes, we monitor you and we say, okay, you're good. And we see you again at the next point, and let's say the algorithm says it's now about 15 minutes to get there, and we see you, you're okay. But when we start to miss points and we start to miss the vehicle moving down this excluded roadway, we'll give it 1 or 2 attempts, and when we don't see it, we're going to make the assumption that it did in fact enter into the central business district. So that's been used, this technology has been used in other ways for tolling, but not in this way yet. The other thing that I want to point out here, and I had mentioned earlier, I had said this is not your traditional toll system. So traditional toll systems, open road systems, have what we refer to as sort of one of those words that cannot be said for us, but I'll say it here, the over-the-road gantries that totally span the roadway and on which the equipment is all anchored. Can't really do that in an urban environment. We're looking to have it blend into the urban landscape and have minimal footprint. So as I mentioned, we removed roughly 100 detection points that would have been required by using the algorithm, but we still have a number of points that we have to address. So what we're using is infrastructure that's already in place. You can see here, and you'll see on the next slide a little bit more, but here you see equipment mounted to a pedestrian walkway that's already in place. We are also clustering the equipment into a single housing. So rather than see all the different pieces that you would normally see going on under a gantry, you will just see these equipment clusters. The equipment clusters are also purposely designed to reflect light in different angles, which makes them actually less noticeable both to those who are driving and to those who are on the pedestrian walkways or on the sidewalks. Again, we have a lot of people walking in New York, so we really have to think about not just how does this look from a visual perspective to someone who's driving and seeing the system, but also to all the people who would be walking around and seeing this system. For the rest of the locations, we're going to be using, in essence, light poles and mast arms and other sign structures. And those light poles and mast arms, if we can just flip to the next slide, I have a couple of pictures there. Thank you. On the right-hand side. These are similar to poles and mast arms that you would actually already find throughout the central business district. We will be working very closely with the designers to situate them in appropriate locations and to have different colors and slightly different styles, again, so that they fit into each of the areas in which they'll be positioned. Where possible, again, we're going to use infrastructure that's already there. Where not, our next step is to replace right where the current light pole or mast arm already exists. And in a few places we have to relocate, or excuse me, locate new infrastructure. But as you see, it's very minimal. In terms of our customer experience, this is one place where we actually do want some consistency. We have a lot of people in this region coming over TBTA's facilities. We already have roughly 95% market penetration for Easy Pass. And as the Port Authority, which is another major institution here, has been moving to all electronic tolling, they're now around 80 to 85% market penetration as well. So no surprise, our system will be relying on Easy Pass and then cameras to detect vehicles. We're going to be using the existing back office and customer service platform, so those who traverse our area today and pay tolls will be very familiar with that portion. So this way they have the new innovation of congestion pricing, different way of tolling, different way of doing things, but the way they pay what they do is very similar. However, we did want to push the boundaries just a little bit, and as I mentioned before, we do have this feature of a third-party interface, which is very innovative. Embedded in the system, we will have a set of criteria, requirements, and any company that can meet those requirements will be able to interface with the system. This does a few things for us. Right away, it offers the ability for our customers to have different ways to pay, different options. It allows us to improve payment rates, have lower costs. But importantly, it encourages innovation. And it allows us, in the position that we're in right now, where there's a lot of innovation going on in the field of tolling, but we don't know ultimately what the best solution is going to be. So it allows us to, in essence, allow everybody to tie in, and we don't have to choose what that new technology is. In essence, it allows us to, I don't know if we want to say future-proof per se, but certainly future prepare, so that we're not betting on a technology and we find out in 3 to 5 years that in fact a different technology has turned out to be better in this urban environment. If that technology is better, it can actually be part of our system anyway. So the final area I want to touch on, and this affects many around the country who might be looking at this type of project, is the process itself. And in fact, it's not just this project, but even other projects that could benefit from some of the boundaries we've been pushing. As I mentioned earlier, because it's the first of its kind program in the United States, and it occurred during a global pandemic, which is unprecedented in its own way, we found ourselves testing the bounds of the administrative regulatory process and breaking new ground in multiple ways. So by way of background, the Federal National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, requires federal agencies to assess and consider the environmental effects of the proposed actions prior to a decision. Our project, because there's federal aid highways within the central business district, needed to go through this process. When we looked at how we would implement, we needed to implement it through FHWA's value pricing pilot program, which I mentioned earlier. And that in essence triggered the NEPA process. So FHWA determined that environmental assessment with robust enhanced outreach would be the appropriate level of documentation for the project. So we had this robust outreach, which meant before we even put a document on the street for public review, we needed to really reach out to the public. That in itself is not really new per se. What made it a little different for us is we have 28 counties involved in this throughout New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Within those 28 counties, we have 23 different federal, state, regional, and local agencies, as well as multiple tribal nations across the 3 locations. Those tribal nations, by the way, are both federal and state. We decided to err on the side of being more inclusive and included everybody. We also have 22 million residents within this area, 12.3 million of whom identify as environmental justice communities or populations. So it really is a massive undertaking to do this kind of outreach for this type of project. To ensure that everyone in the region had an opportunity to speak, and they will continue to have opportunities, and to learn about the project, and also do this in the middle of a pandemic, we developed an extensive outreach campaign and fully virtual sessions. Those virtual sessions, in essence, we modeled actually on some of the work that MTA had already been doing for our regular sort of toll and fare increase hearings. What we found, interestingly and importantly, was we actually had much better turnout doing things virtually than in person. People didn't have as much trouble getting to the locations. We didn't have to worry about physical accessibility or finding a location that was large enough to have everybody there. Because as was said earlier, one of the benefits of having virtual is we have ability to tie many more people in. We advertised in roughly 40 publications in multiple languages throughout the entire region. We had posters in every MTA bus, subway, and rail station and digital ads elsewhere. Everything was in 9 different languages, again, by virtue of our region that has even many more than that. We used radio ads, social media, the project website. We have phone lines, email, fax, regular mail options for submitting comments, and we have an online form. We had agency coordination meetings, and ultimately, as part of the early outreach, held 10 public webinars and 9 webinars focused entirely on environmental justice communities and issues. Each had a live introduction followed by presentation and then comment period. And of course, we stayed however many hours were needed. My favorite was the one where we broke nearly the 5-hour mark. We had American Sign Language at every event, and we also provided simultaneous language translation upon request for any language, well beyond the 9 that we had, although we didn't have as many requests, but we wanted to make sure that that was available. And during the sessions, we answered questions in real time via the webinar QA function. So in essence, we held them like open houses to the degree that we could, even though they were virtual. And we had participants join the webinar directly, view a live stream on YouTube, or participate by phone. And all of the events were then left on YouTube. And this way people could look at it whenever they wanted, 24 hours a day, at any of the events, all of the events, or the presentations by themselves. In addition to all this, and to ensure meaningful engagement with environmental justice communities, we also convened an environmental justice technical advisory group, for which we held 3 meetings and 1 is still to come. and an environmental justice stakeholder working group, which had 2 meetings, with one still to come. The difference between them was the technical advisory group is comprised of people who work on environmental justice issues as part of their sort of business that they do, right? They're nonprofits, associations that are very familiar with issues related to environmental justice. The stakeholder working group provided an additional avenue for those throughout the 28 counties who identify as environmental justice to be able to participate and say, hey, I want to do more than what you've already put out there. I want to actually have this meaningful engagement in some smaller forum, and I'd like to participate in this. So it allowed them to self-identify and become part of the process as well. And finally, we've been holding ad hoc discussions upon request when appropriate. The outcome of all this, as you can see here, we had over 1,000 registrants. We've had to date, and actually not even to date, this is about a month old now, over 14,000 YouTube views of the various events and presentations combined. And we've already got over 7,000 comments. And this is before we've even published the document itself for public review. So over the next few months, just to wrap up, we anticipate releasing the draft environmental assessment and holding another round of webinar-style hearings this time, with another formal comment period, but this time specifically on the environmental assessment, which will be public at that point. We anticipate the numbers that you see here on the slide are going to increase substantially, demonstrating again the efficacy of having this virtual option. And as I mentioned before, we've seen better turnout, and we're very much hoping going forward that even though there's real benefit to having in-person meetings as well, that this ability to have virtual meetings will not just go away once COVID is past us, it will be incorporated into what we do going forward for these types of processes. Finally, to give you a sense of what's ahead, we're addressing the comments on the draft document at this point with the goal of releasing it to the public several months from now. Once we've done that and held those hearings, we'll make the final changes, and we're still aiming for a decision document by the end of this year. By that point, we'll have tested and pushed the federal processes in ways that we really believe will pave the way for others around the country to follow. As I said, not just for congestion pricing purposes, but any type of NEPA process. And of course, we'll then get to work on finalizing our innovative system and infrastructure design, as well as constructing and commencing tolling operations for this first of its kind program in the United States. Thank you.
Alison, thank you so much. Wow, I would have so many questions for you right now, but I'm going to exercise some self-restraint and not ask any, but I would encourage any of our audience members to put questions for Alison or Dahlia or Kathy or Greg coming up into the chat box, and we'll get to those as soon as we can during the meeting. So Alison, thank you very much. Earlier we heard Supervisor Alcorn refer to the cutting edge, and I think this is the perfect segue to Kathy, whose presentation I think talks about the cutting edge. So Kathy, over to you.
Great, thank you. I did note the distinction between cutting edge and bleeding edge earlier in some of the comments, and I hope that with RM3P we manage to stay on the cutting edge and don't fall off onto the bleeding edge, but we'll see. So I think there we go. All right, if you could just go ahead to the next slide. I want to really briefly just describe what RM3P is before we dive into a discussion about some of the more innovative elements within the program. So RM3P, somebody mentioned earlier that all the acronyms we have, and obviously here I'm adding another one. RM3P is the Regional Multimodal Mobility Program, which was, interestingly enough, proposed by MVTA as a smart scale project. It was born from an earlier integrated corridor management planning project, and we're so excited now to see it come to fruition. RM3P does have 4 program elements. We started with 5, and we'll talk about why we're now down to 4. But the four active program elements are the data exchange platform, the heart of RM3P, which is a cloud-based data exchange and storage system that allows us to both capture and then share information across a number of data sources, both historic and real time, in order to manage the system more effectively holistically. To that end, the second program element is the AI-based decision support system, which uses all of that data to recommend strategies that, again, will allow us to manage from that high-level perspective the transportation system as a whole, and to deal with both planned and unexpected events that pop up in that network. The third program element is our commuter parking information system. Again, knowing where parking is available allows users of the transportation system to change modes and to make decisions in real time about what the best route and mode for them might be on any given day. And then the fourth element is our dynamic incentivization. And Dahlia mentioned in her remarks a bit about incentivization and how we get behavior change across the region. And so it's a really important and obviously innovative element of the RM3P program for us. All of these program elements working together are really intended to improve reliability within our network. We know that that's really important to commuters, understanding how long a trip is going to take, no matter what the mode choice is. But we also want to improve safety and overall mobility in the system. So I think I do want to point out that RM3P really is based on really strong partnerships. MVTA is a big a contributor to this program, really, really important partner, as is VDOT, DRPT. All of the localities in the region will be really important as we roll out RM3P. Next slide, please. Again, as we talk about RM3P, I think it's important to point out that this is not something that's being pushed down from the top. As it's actually growing up from all of the partners that are a part of the RM3P program. It's lots of agencies and entities working together to not only provide data, but to talk about what those management strategies should be, and to really work to manage the overall system more effectively. We are using an agile development process. We know that we don't know everything going in, but we are very open to innovation. And as you see our procurements coming together, we really hope that our private sector partners bring innovation to the table with their solutions for us. I think one of the most innovative parts of RM3P that I really want to focus on today is the fact that we're bringing commuters in as part of the solution to our transportation challenges by allowing them to make behavioral changes, by encouraging them to make those changes through incentivization. They can see how they actually benefit the overall transportation network performance by making those changes. I think it will be really fascinating to see how that rolls out when the time comes, and how users really embrace their role in being a part of the solution. Next slide, please. So just to dive in a little deeper on each of the program elements, the data exchange platform, again, is the heart of RM3P. It allows us to collect and process and make decisions on data across the region. But we didn't start from scratch here. We were able to leverage an existing platform provided by the University of Maryland, their RIDIS platform. So we really had a head start here, and I think that's really important for us in terms of meeting our timelines going forward. We did divide this, the rollout of the data exchange platform, into 6 epochs of 3 months each, so we can account for any challenges. And let me tell you, when you're talking about data, I don't care what the source is, there are going to be challenges. And we can account for those within those epochs and not lose a lot of time as we go along. Obviously, with the data exchange platform, we really want it to be scalable. We want to be able to add additional data sources as they become available. And we want to make sure that the platform is developed in a way that allows the sharing as appropriate of data with others, even outside of the RM3P where that's allowable. Next slide, please. The decision support system, again, sits on top of that data exchange platform, uses all of the data in the platform to allow us to make better decisions. We are looking for a software as a service. We've learned how many times we've learned that internally developed, at least DOT developed software platforms, while they might meet the need initially, they're really hard to maintain over the long run. So we are looking for software as a service through our RFP process. We feel like that will allow us to take advantage of upgrades that vendors make over time and really add value to the overall program. We're also asking for innovation. We're asking vendors to bring good ideas to the table. While we have very well-defined requirements for our decision support system, we also left it open enough, we hope, to bring in innovation as the system is built. The most important thing coming out of our decision support system is that AI approach and the ability that it gives us to be proactive in terms of our responses as opposed to purely reactive, which is so much of what we see in transportation management today. Next slide, please. Our dynamic incentivization program element, again, is likely the most innovative part of RM3P. Obviously, it carries with it some increased risk in terms of how successful we are, but it really does bring the customer, the consumer, the commuter into the solution space, and we think that that's really important. We want to maximize adoption. The incentivization piece will rely on an app that users will opt into, and so we're working really hard to figure out how best to get people to buy into that. We are looking for a solution that is financially sustainable over time. So many commuter incentive programs, travel demand management programs, rely on ongoing government support to be successful. We believe that this incentivization program can be financially sustainable on its own with at least limited government funding, and that is really a goal that we've set out for this program. We'll see as our RFP responses come in how successful we are with that, but we definitely have that as a goal for our program. I would add that we know that there are apps out there for incentivization that provide some, but not all, of what we're looking for through our DI. For example, there are programs that encourage commuters to switch to transit and actually give them rewards the more transit rides they take. But those incentives are typically not dynamic in nature. So we are hoping to build upon existing third-party apps, and we don't see our program for incentivization as a single app solution. We're building it in a way that will allow multiple apps to interface with our back end while ensuring that travelers only receive one incentive, even if they have multiple apps that they interact with. We also certainly intend to interact closely with existing TDM programs to leverage the good work that's already happening in the region and just extend that through our dynamic incentivization. Next slide, please. The final program element that I'd like to talk to you about this morning is the commuter parking information system. Again, we're looking at data as a service with this. We're looking for private sector partners that can come in with a low infrastructure solution for parking availability and provide us with data that would indicate parking usage status information, as opposed to there are 43 spots available in lot X, just there's high availability, low availability, somewhere in the middle. We believe that allowing that flexibility does enable a light infrastructure approach, which is our preferred approach. But again, we look to procure the data as opposed to purchasing the hardware to collect that data. Really important information element, though, in terms of being able to direct users to alternate modes. Availability of parking is a key element. So if you or someone you know has parking as a part of their professional role, please talk to us. We'd love to hear more about your parking availability information systems. Next slide, final slide, I think. Oh, yes. So as we move forward, we're looking for more folks to join us in our RM3P efforts. Again, as I mentioned earlier, our data exchange platform is being developed in a way that we can continue to include and incorporate more data sources. So we'd love to have others join us on this journey and bring their data to the table. We also want to make sure that all of the regional operating entities are at the table as we discuss the decision support system and the responses that are a part of that, not only in developing potential responses, but also in making sure that they are engaged as we deploy those responses going forward. We certainly are open to other ways to leverage RM3P as we move forward to full deployment. Complete trip information is very important to us. Bringing more bike share information, additional parking, as I said earlier, all of that is really important to us. So we'd love to hear your ideas as we move forward on that as well. I believe I am way out of time, so I'm going to stop there, but look forward to your questions and further discussion as we reach that part of this panel. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you so much. And thanks for your leadership on our M3P. We greatly appreciate what you do. Both Kathy and our final panelists this morning, Greg Rogers, are members of our Transportation Technology Committee. This committee was created at the suggestion of Monica Bachmann, our CEO, and the committee has greatly helped us in developing MBTA's Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, which Chair Randall mentioned earlier in her comments, and that was approved just under a year ago. So both Kathy and Greg and Bob Schneider from the earlier panel were very instrumental in helping us accomplish that. And One of the things that the strategic plan includes is a strategy that addresses the concern about zero occupant vehicles clogging up Northern Virginia streets in the years and decades ahead. But we went to some length to ensure that we were talking about zero occupant passenger vehicles and not zero occupant freight vehicles, which Greg is about to talk about. So with that, I'll hand over to Greg.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Keith, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking NVTA for inviting me to speak today. It's been a real pleasure to serve on the Transportation Technology Committee over the years, and as a resident of this region, it's just really wonderful to see how our leaders have combined their passion for serving the public with a spirit of innovation. So thank you to you all for the work that you're doing every day. And so I'm thrilled to be joining you all today to share a little bit about what we're working on at Neuro and why it's important to consider not just how our transportation system moves people, but also how we're moving goods. And as Keith mentioned, my background is as a think tank researcher and also a reporter. So I'll also share some big picture ideas of how AV technology fits into our broader transportation system. And I did appreciate seeing the polls that Mackenzie shared because it did show how delivery is becoming an important part of our mobility ecosystem. So as Keith mentioned, my name is Greg Rogers. I'm Public Policy Manager at Neuro. Neuro is based in Mountain View, California, and our mission is to better everyday life through robotics. And so we started by building autonomous electric vehicles for local delivery, like you see here. And just a note on terminology, from here on, I'll be using the term delivery AVs to refer to this type of vehicle. So at Neuro, our goal is to provide fast and affordable deliveries to consumers as close to free as possible. And in doing so, we hope to level the playing field for local retail in the era of e-commerce and increased digitalizations. We have partnerships with Kroger, Domino's, FedEx, and Walmart. We're delivering in Houston today, delivering groceries with Kroger. And last summer, you might have even seen a TV ad about our delivery service with Domino's, where they brought back the Avoid the Noid campaign. And so, our mission is to connect people with those essential items, regardless whether they can own a car, whether they can afford a car, or even if they're able to drive a car. And since we're exclusively focused on transporting goods, and since we're building autonomous vehicles, we really saw a huge opportunity to rethink what vehicles look like. So here, time for some show and tell. You'll see our second generation vehicle, the R2. This is a zero occupant vehicle. There are no steering wheels, no brake pedals, no rearview mirrors. It operates on public roadways. And so what we really see is this opportunity to rethink our relationship to vehicles and how we use them, which will unlock a lot of benefits for everyone. So we'll get into that in a couple of minutes here. Next slide, please. Thanks. So first of all, I just want to note that we spend a lot of time running errands. And often we think about transportation in terms of moving people. But 43% of household trips in personal vehicles are actually for shopping and errands. And in comparison, just 24% of trips are for commuting. And so when you think about it, that's really incredible, because when we think about the fact that our transportation systems are usually planned around commuting trips, it reveals that we've been focusing on smoothing out rush hours, those few hours in the morning and in the evenings, and overlooking those barriers people face every day and conducting other trips. And here's another reason why this is important. It's that e-commerce is grabbing a lot of headlines these days, but before the pandemic, 90% of retail still happened at the local level, and just 10% of retail is e-commerce. And even during the pandemic, e-commerce reached just 15% of overall retail in the US. And so local commerce will continue to be important. That includes shopping in person. That also includes pickup orders. We order online, you pick up at the store. Or delivery from local stores. So this is what we'll be doing. And that will remain the backbone of our economy. Next slide, please. So I'd like to note here that the way we're shopping today just is not sustainable when you look at our existing system. Traffic deaths are a public health crisis that killed 38,824 people and injured 4.8 million people in 2020. And road fatalities has spiked further in 2021. An estimated 31,720 people died in crashes from just January to September of last year. And we're still waiting for final statistics for the last 3 months of 2021, but it's anticipated that if the trend continues, we'll see 40,000 fatalities happen on the roads last year, which is the highest we've seen in over a decade. And why is this happening? Key causes of crashes, some of the top ones are drunk driving, distraction, speeding, and reckless driving. And I think we've all seen over the past couple of years that those things are on the rise. But the way that our roads are designed also presents some inherent tremendous safety risks. Our streets are currently designed to move people quickly, or move vehicles quickly, and not always prioritize the safety of other road users. That means pedestrians, cyclists, and people in wheelchairs. And so it's important that we don't just adopt technology, but also look at how can we take a safe systems approach to improving our overall transportation system safety. Also, environmental damage. Transportation is the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Overall in the US, it's 29% of US emissions. And gas-powered vehicles is the largest source of particulate matter emissions, which are really the most deadly environmental hazard today. And so that's really concerning when we start to think about all the large diesel vehicles that are left idling on the street making deliveries in our neighborhoods daily. And also, the way we shop today presents an economic strain. Yes, we've seen a growth in online ordering, but there's also just a really high cost to local businesses for delivery today. And long term, we need to give local businesses new chances to compete in the digital economy. And I'd like to note also that a lot of on-demand delivery as it exists now is powered by low-paying gig jobs that are seeing high turnover and a lot of challenges for workers. Lack of access is also a huge issue. Transportation is a really major barrier to accessing daily essentials. Next slide, please. And so in building autonomous delivery vehicles, our approach was to design vehicles that drive safer, avoiding a lot of the causes of crashes today, which are, as I mentioned, driving under the influence, speeding, and reckless driving. And since we don't have anyone inside of our vehicles when we're conducting deliveries, that means we're able to drive, number one, at the speed limit, but drive more conservatively. There's no one inside to get impatient, which means we can have conservative routing and driving behavior and lower speeds. And as I mentioned, with the vehicle design, with the zero occupant vehicle design, we're able to take a lot of the safety innovations we've seen over the past 60 years and turn those inside out. Traditionally, we've been designing vehicles to protect people inside the vehicle. But what we're focused on is protecting the people outside the vehicle, because Domino's can always make you another piping hot pineapple pizza. What's important is protecting the people inside or outside who are on the roadways. And in fact, Virginia Tech Transportation Institute published a study last year finding that zero-occupant vehicle designs like this can reduce the risk of fatalities or injuries by 60% for every mile when we replace manual driving. It means it's because there's no occupant at risk. We have a narrower vehicle to help avoid crashes and lighter vehicle weight. And additionally, with zero emissions vehicles, we're able to reduce those emissions from trips in our neighborhoods. I think it's also important to think about this in terms of building a multimodal ecosystem. As we've been talking about on this panel, it's really important to provide people with alternatives that will encourage less carbon intensive modes and a shift away from relying on the personal automobile. And so if we start to think about it this way, how do we provide people those alternatives to say, okay, I don't need a car to be able to go shopping? You avoid that sunk cost and potentially allow people to shift more easily to saying, okay, I will use this delivery service to get the things that I need from local stores, and then instead commute or visit with friends or socialize by traveling by bike or transit. And And one last thing I want to mention is time, which is especially resonant with me today. My wife and I are expecting our firstborn in May. And the one thing that I keep on hearing from every parent is enjoy your time while you have it now, and your sleep. And our robots can't solve the sleep part, but we can help with driving to and from the grocery store, which I think is really important because with autonomous delivery, a report that we conducted with Steer found that between 2025 and 2035, autonomous delivery can help to save people 21 billion hours that would have been spent driving to and from the store, which is the equivalent of recouping 1.5 hours every week. Let's go to the next slide. I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions here. I'd like to wrap up with one thing that's really important to me and really near and dear to my heart. And I'll provide a sort of regional context for this. Several years ago, I decided to get into the transportation sector and made a big change in careers. And as part of this, I started driving for Uber and Lyft in order to make money and start to write about transportation and get into the sector. And one thing I noticed about driving folks in the DMV is that a lot of my passengers requested rides from Ward 7 and 8 in Washington, D.C. But unlike a lot of my other passengers in the Central District, they weren't going to galas, they weren't going to Capitol Hill, they weren't going to nightclubs, they weren't going to happy hour. They're going to the grocery store, and they're paying $20 each way to do it. That's because it often took 1 to 2 hours to get to and from the store on public transit. And they couldn't leave their kids at home for that long, and they could only carry a handful of grocery bags on the bus to feed their family for a week. And a lot of the challenges that came from this, number one is the transportation challenge, but number two, it was a result of disinvestment in a lot of these communities. Out of the 49 grocery stores in DC, there are only 3 full-service grocery stores in Ward 7 and 8, so predominantly underrepresented, predominantly Black communities. And our neighbors are being let down not just by disinvestment in their communities, but also by a transportation system that has not fully met their needs. And our analysis at Neuro found that there are 20 million low-income Americans living in food deserts, and that with autonomous delivery, we can help to serve up to 70% of those Americans, or 14 million. And that's the thing that we're very serious about doing at Neuro, is ensuring that we are helping to serve folks who have limited access. But with that, you can go to the next slide, Mackenzie. Thank you. I will leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Well, that was a lot of innovation. The good news is we heard a number of really thought-provoking ideas for where transportation is headed. The less good news is we have much less time than anticipated for the discussion, but we'll try to make the most of it. So I think each presentation, was really sort of independent of the other. So I'm just going to sort of go through each of you and ask questions as time permits. So starting with Dahlia, I noticed that well, first of all, your first scenario, the first of the 3 scenarios that you mentioned, was that the current trends from the pandemic continue. That is more telework, more deliveries, instead of people going out shopping. And I'm just wondering, based on what I know, it's early, but people are, saying that the pandemic is coming to the end and that things are going back to normal a little bit. So what have you seen? What are the early signs about whether those pandemic trends are going to continue?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I should probably add in something that I forgot to mention, is that we're looking at forecasting and analysis for the year 2045. So while nobody disagrees that next month and next year we're still going to have pandemic impacts, 2045 is still a ways away. And so that universe could look very, very different from what we're talking about over the course of the next year. From what we're seeing based on surveys, both of employers and of employees, it does look like we're seeing an increased interest in, you know, what I'll call the hybrid work schedule, right? Where folks are coming in a few days a week as opposed to 5 days a week. So we're looking at, you know, does that result in an increase of, or a decrease, sorry, of commute travel of maybe 20% on an average day? Are we seeing that really, that telework really pushed on Mondays and Fridays, because people like to have those days at home? So does that impact sort of our traffic much more on those particular days? And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I'm willing to give up all of my deliveries and go back to going to the store to get everything. I'm sort of enjoying that, and I'm finding it to be very convenient. I think there are a lot of businesses in the world, maybe Greg's included, that are banking on that being a long-term trend for a lot of people. So I think so long as those continue to be convenient options for people, I think we'll continue to see them. But again, 2045 is far.
Yeah, and I didn't understand that you're looking at 2045. I mean, the first panel, they were predicting, you know, that we'd be basically having predominantly electric vehicles within 5 to 10 years, 2045. That's we may have the jet packs by then that people were talking about in the previous panel.
You know, it's really interesting. We could, but we also could not. Cars stick around in the fleet for a really long time, particularly for low-income folks who don't buy new cars, who don't buy new cars frequently. You know, cars tend to last in our vehicle fleet for 16 to 17 years on average before they get sort of cycled out and totaled out. That means a full transition to electric vehicles, a full transition to automated vehicles, a full transition to flying skateboards is going to take a really long time. And so 2045 is far, but it's also not far, depending on what you're really thinking about.
Well, I'm glad you're looking that far ahead, and I actually don't believe that we'll have jet packs by then. Now, another thing I noticed was in the three scenarios you mentioned, two of them basically anticipate considerably less congestion. The first one, the pandemic trends continue. We have more telework. We have more deliveries and people aren't going out shopping as much. And then the third one, obviously, if we're going to have a vehicle miles traveled fee, which is something that a lot of people have been recommending as a way to pay for roads and infrastructure.
And improved transit service.
And improved transit. You know, that was on my list. I was coming to that. Free transit, vehicle miles traveled fees. That's going to lead to less congestion. And then even the second one, the middle one, the CASE vehicles, connected automated shared electric vehicles, could go either way in terms of more or less congestion. So it seems as though most of your scenarios are anticipating less congestion, which would certainly be very welcome in this region.
And I think that's less congestion compared to, say, a baseline future in which, let's be honest, we envision all the congestion, because that's what Northern Virginia is used to, and Northern Virginia is expecting to continue on the path of significant growth in population, in households, right, that we've been seeing over the last several decades. And so that baseline scenario that I referenced really briefly, without any of these disruptions, really does have huge increases in population, employment, and with it, that congestion. And so there isn't a whole lot of up to go from there, if we're talking about that. And so what we were trying to envision are what are some of these major disruptors, like the pandemic or like connected automated vehicles, that could really turn the future on its head a little bit, and what might those impacts be? And that's turning Northern Virginia's congestion on its head really does mean decreases, as those of you who live here know. And so that's part of the reason why some of those scenarios are really looking at that direction of things. And so we're trying to think of what are the investments that NVTA and the jurisdictions really want to be making in the transportation system to make sure that, you know, we get to a 2045 that is economically healthy and congestion is limited and people have a good quality of life here. And so if there are opportunities to eliminate congestion or reduce congestion, whether it's with pricing, whether it's with automated vehicles, whether it's, you know, by increasing those telework percentages, and then we can spend our money on better things, that's a thing we'd want to know. And that's a thing, you know, we'd want to be prepared for now, to the extent that we can.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's jump now to Alison De Sereno, talking about from our visitor from out of state, from the great metropolis of New York City, talking about congestion pricing, or CBTP, the Central Business District Tolling Program. So Alison, you know, you're talking about basically Southern Manhattan, and having congestion pricing there. You know, this is the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority event, and I'm just wondering, what can you tell us, if anything, about how this kind of project might work in the suburbs? Because these are the suburbs. Now, they're pretty, you talk about Arlington and Alexandria, and you're talking about, you know, inner city, you know, close-in suburbs. But they're still suburbs. It ain't Manhattan. So how would you see this kind of project working in the suburbs, both close-in suburbs and outer suburbs like Loudoun or Prince William?
Excuse me. I think there's a couple of things. One is, beyond the project, as I mentioned, I think some of the processes that we've been pushing the boundaries on with the feds will actually be helpful for everybody moving forward when they're doing projects, whether it's suburban, whether it's urban, or whether it's rural, in terms of the sort of new positioning down in Washington about how to do outreach, when to do outreach, and how that needs to be embedded in the federal process. So that's going to be beneficial for everybody. In terms of congestion pricing, one of the things that's really important is that even though congestion pricing as a concept can work in a lot of different places, how it's actually implemented is necessarily needs to be tied to or modified depending upon where it's being implemented. So for a location like Southern Manhattan, a congestion pricing district or zone or cordon, if you will, right, that sort of specifies where you're going, makes a lot of sense. Tying it to transit investment, as opposed to, say, what London did, where it was really just focused on congestion. Again, for a transit rich region where we need the investment in transit to get more and more people off the roadways, makes a lot of sense. When you're talking about more suburban areas, I think, again, it needs to be tailored to the area. Is it, you know, congestion pricing or value pricing is actually a continuum, right? Everything from pricing the miles traveled to pricing roadways like managed lanes or hot lanes, all the way to congestion pricing. We see it really as a continuum. And we're at one end of the continuum. Depending upon what locations you're looking at, you may find that certain districts actually do work if there is a clear defined area. But in areas where there are major roadways coming in and out, those lend themselves more to managed lanes. So again, it needs to be tailored. We anticipate that even places that are urban that are looking at it, like LA, like Philadelphia, and some others, are not going to look quite the same as ours looks. Similarly, the technology itself, and actually let me speak to that for a moment too. Again, even if you don't move toward full congestion pricing, the kind of technology we're using, while it will be the first of its kind that's been implemented anywhere with the poles and the mast arms, and that's something that's actually another takeaway. So even if it's not the program itself, the takeaways are important. Wherever you do have tolling or are considering tolling, the investment in tolling infrastructure is not small, and the operations and maintenance for that is not, the costs are not small. So that to the degree that you can minimize the footprint, potentially even on major highways, which you do have throughout the entire eastern seaboard, is something that's going to be very beneficial to multiple locations, both from a visual perspective for the people traveling and importantly for the agencies that have to have those costs. And of course, cost is part of what it costs you for the tolling system itself. So if you can reduce costs, you don't have to raise the tolls as high.
Follow-up question. You talked a lot about all the outreach that you've done to sort of, not just obviously in Manhattan, but all over the greater New York region. So what kind of feedback are you getting? I mean, people don't usually, we haven't had this in the United States before. They have had it in some other countries. People don't usually like being told that they have to start paying for something they haven't paid for before. So what's the political climate, I guess, regarding this proposal?
So it's really interesting. When we go through the comments, we have roughly half the comments in terms of the majority of the comments were actually informative or informational type comments, like how is this going to work? What are you going to do? When is it going to happen? When we remove those and are just looking at kind of support versus concern about the project, they're split roughly half and half. We had comments, everything from people who are just adamantly against tolls, who feel that we're already overburdened in this region, given how many toll systems there are already, to people who very clearly would like to see this project. Even folks who spoke out to say not only do they want to see this project, but they don't want any more exemptions, discounts, or credits given. That it should be just as it is in the legislation and nothing more, nothing less. And they come, by the way, to be really clear, from all over. One of the, we did have, you would think that some of the folks who are coming into the region from some of the other states would be more concerned about it and express more dissatisfaction. But in fact, we had a number of people from New Jersey, from Connecticut, who were really supportive of this as well. I think when it all gets said and done, this region has people come from all over the country, and on a typical day, we have a lot of people coming from outside the CBD into the CBD. And all of those people, once they're inside here, the vast majority of them actually use transit in some form or fashion, right? They jump out to go grab something to eat. They have to go up to another meeting somewhere else outside the zone, whatever it is, they end up using transit. And so I think a number of people are seeing a benefit regardless of whether or not they're going to have to pay some more. And finally, for the drivers themselves, yes, a number of the drivers are not supportive, but we had drivers who are supportive because they're aiming to see reduced congestion, better speeds. Obviously, it's in a city environment. You're not doing 75 miles an hour, but you're still going to have at least the speed limit post speeds we would hope for, along with more reliability. And that actually spans across all three states too in the comments.
Thank you. Okay, I want to acknowledge Supervisor Walter Alcorn from Fairfax has pointed out that we do have a form of congestion pricing already on I-66 and on the Beltway, but of course it's not the same as what Allison's been describing, where basically entering a certain neighborhood, you're going to be charged just for going into the neighborhood. Okay, let's jump now to Kathy McGee, talking about the RM3P project. So pardon my ignorance here, Kathy, but I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how this app works and how the dynamic incentives work. Are you going to be charging people more? Are you going to be giving people rebates if they use transit or if they don't drive at a certain time? I mean, how do these incentives work? How does this app work?
So I'll start by saying it doesn't exist today. We're going through the procurement process now to pick a vendor to provide the incentivization piece for us. But our thoughts are that incentives could take any number of forms. And it would be completely voluntary. If you wanted to participate, you download the app to your phone. It would know your typical time and route and mode of travel. If an issue is detected that would impact you personally, you would receive possibly an offered incentive. And that could be, if you would delay your time of travel, we'll give you a coupon to your local coffee shop. You can go grab a cup of coffee and delay your time of travel. It could be free transit. If you're willing to change modes today, we'll give you a transit trip to encourage that, a parking incentive. There are lots of potential ways the incentives could go, but the idea is to target them in such a way that the commuter we're attempting to change the behavior of is encouraged to do that. Again, it doesn't take everybody changing their mode or time of travel to really see an impact. As few as 5% of the vehicles, if we could move them off of an impacted roadway, we could see real benefit. So we're open to lots of different forms of incentives, but again, the long-term financial sustainability is really important to us. So getting private sector partnerships established will be really important.
So basically, I can get myself a free latte if I agree to leave half an hour later. Is the
Correct.
yeah. That sounds like a pretty good deal to me, actually. One other question I had: have you thought about privacy concerns, or does nobody care about privacy anymore? They just assume that companies know everything we're doing on our iPhones and laptops.
We definitely are thinking about privacy, and that is part of our requirements for the app itself, is to make sure that we do protect the privacy of users. Now, that being said, we have to have a way to make sure users aren't double dipping, aren't getting multiple incentives from different apps. But there are ways to handle that and still protect the personal information of users of the app. And we will be making sure that we do everything we can to comply with best practices when it comes to privacy, because that is very, very important to us. But again, the app is completely optional. No one has to participate, but we do believe that it will provide significant benefits to those who choose to do so.
All right. So last but not least, Greg Rogers talking about AVs, autonomous electric vehicles for delivery. So I was really interested in the some of the benefits that you described there, such as obviously reducing shopping time, but also providing access to people who don't have the kind of ability that I do to get to the grocery store. So I'm just curious, you're already running this program in Houston. What kind of reception are you getting? Is it getting, is there a lot of growth? Are people embracing it in Houston? How's it going there?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Robert. It's been really amazing the response we've gotten from residents of Houston. There's just a lot of interest in adopting the delivery service, but the thing that really puts a smile on my face is the smiles on the faces of kids when they're coming out to pick up a delivery with their parents. It's been really inspiring to see just how excited a lot of the kids are, and as a result, we've actually started to do some more work with local robotics clubs for high school robotics teams. And we're also working with community colleges, starting to look at how can we not just provide this delivery service to help meet the needs of folks, but also inspire the next generation of folks who are going to go into STEM, who are going to go into these technical careers, and how can we support that and create those pathways into those jobs. So it has been really great to see all of this interest. Folks are delighted to see the bot driving down their street and getting the delivery from it, which has been just I just want to note as well that it's really important to us too that we're going out and meeting folks in the community and letting them know before the technology reaches their streets. So residents of Houston have seen us at local arts fairs, other local events. So we really do put in the effort to make sure that folks are aware of us, that they know these vehicles are on the road, and they can always reach out to us if they ever have questions.
Okay. Well, we went a little bit over time, but Mackenzie gave me permission, since we didn't have as much time for Q&A as we had originally hoped, but we have certainly got a lot to think about with all of this innovation and all of this long-term creative thinking about what to do in the transportation sector. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and I will hand it back to Mackenzie.
Thank you, Bob, and all of the panelists. Again, just wonderful to hear all of the things that can be coming to our transportation system and elsewhere in the country soon. And thank you for your work on those things. You'll bear with me for one moment. I'm going to try to take us through two more polls quickly, and you can participate in them in the same way as in the past. The first poll that we'll ask you now is, how will the post-pandemic new normal change the way you think about travel-related behavior? And this is a free response, so please feel free to send entire sentences if you'd like. And you can submit up to 3 different answers here. For a little bit of background, when we're talking about travel-related behaviors, that could be not only will you change how you commute, but it could also be will you have more things delivered, thinking about it from a holistic way in regards to the way you travel through the region. And this will be a good chance to reflect on several of the different things that we heard from our panelists who were talking about things like the impact of the pandemic on the way we plan for travel and how we can work with travel behaviors going forward. So I'm seeing some responses starting to come in about changes to work behaviors, like using non-traditional peak periods to travel to work, perhaps, work from home, more telework, things that might change the way you use the transportation system, like using streeteries, which are repurposing parking for outdoor dining, avoiding crowds and working from home, looking for shorter commutes. So a lot of this seems to be looking at commuting behavior changes and using the infrastructure differently. But also we're seeing things like opening streets for biking and eating, looking for more developments in our transit system, and reducing non-work trips during the day as well. Okay, so people are saying, you know, they're going to change the way they think about non-work trips but commuting trips in particular, and maybe looking at mode shifts, travel time shifts, thinking about maybe having more things delivered as well. So I think a lot of those are kind of the high notes that our panelists hit on across their varied transportation innovations. While they're taking different forms, they're kind of working towards the same ends. And this multimodal approach is something, again, that NVTA values a lot. So thank you, everyone, for that. I'd love to keep this open because this is fascinating to hear your feedback. But I'm going to move on to the next poll now. If you would like to provide us any feedback, of course, you can always reach out to NVTA elsewise as well. All right, so thank you, everyone. We'll ask you to provide your thoughts one more time, and in this instance, about today's event itself. Overall, how would you rate today's event? Please consider both the overall experience, being the virtual platforms we used, the way we engage with the audiences, and also the content that was presented by our wonderful panelists and moderators. I'll give you all a few minutes to respond here. Watch those come in. And I want to, again, thank you all for being engaged with us, for taking the time to be here today, but also engaging with us throughout the event through these polls. It really helps us connect with you all and make sure that we are consistent with what you're looking for from NVTA and any events that we put on both now and going forward. So this is really valuable to us. I think the number of responses is starting to slow down here. So I'll move on shortly, but it looks like you all were happy with today's event. So thank you for letting us know that. And if you have any additional feedback, we're always happy to accept that through the chat boxes as well. Or you can reach out to us directly. So thanks again. And with that, I will hand it over to NVTA's CEO, Monica Backman, for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Mackenzie. And I just want to know, it was very interesting to see how everyone participated in this event and how they think the post-pandemic new normal will impact their own travel behaviors. And I'm saying how they think it will because, in all honesty, we are probably still in the pandemic, but not where we were this time 2 years ago, which is actually progress. So what I would say, looking to the future in this way is a great way to end this event. I want to thank Chair Phyllis Randall, David Ludwig, and the ITS Society of Virginia and Cambridge Systematics. Finally, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us here today. If you would like to see more opportunities to further what we're doing and seeing what we're doing on May the 4th, when we will be participating in the annual Northern Virginia Joint Transportation meeting. We are going to use this meeting as our open house for our FY 2022-2027 6-year program. And then on May the 12th, we are going to have our public hearing for that program. As a reminder, the public comment period will be open April 15th through May the 22nd. And again, we appreciate any feedback you would like to provide. And thank you for spending your morning with us today. Thank you.